We go live. We go live. We go live. Yes, we do. We go live. We go live. We go live. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? Today is Norway Stands, World War II, if Norway repels the German invasion. And it's the 19th of October, 2023. We have the wonderful time of having gone to Portsmouth yesterday. And what else do we have going on? Well, I've kind of got an ulcer on two of my tongues. Or rather, two ulcers on my tongue. I've got three ulcers on my tongue, really. And, yeah. Having a bit of fun. I got so interrupted in the singing, I managed to muck my own chain of thought up there. So, yeah. I do understand why sometimes people think that Iron Brew is an alcoholic drink. I can assure you it is not an alcoholic drink, and I don't drink alcohol. But I can understand why some people sometimes think I am. That's the problem of having my brain going in multiple directions at once. Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? We needed that. We did. Right then. Hello, everyone. I have set up all the stuff. Oh, as always, there will be a Discord chat after this. A link down below to Discord. I'll be in the general chat, chatting away, I think, this week. And, yeah. It's going to be a lot of fun. Not quite chaos corruption, just... I was speaking, I was singing, and I was also concentrating on the pouring. And the three things combined, and it got confused. Let's see. Hello, 96831. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Carmen Gasberg. Hello, Michael Cooch. Hello, Serban Kratu. Hello, DH89. Hello, Spindrift. Hello, Paul Amos. Hello, Matthias Slavic. Hello, I've said DGV40. Let's get going. Which of the Ds have I said hello to? Hello, Dunrick Ironhammer. Hello, Stephen Richards. Hello, BlackburnMaximus. Glad you're here. This is the top patron topic you suggested. Hello, Joss Funk. Hello, Malaga. Hello, Dunrick Ironhammer. Hello, John Shea. Now, rants about Norway. There could be many. In fact, I've had a few. But there again, too many to mention. And frankly, there is other stuff which gets into this one. It becomes interesting to talk through because of the other things that come through. And I've got a fair number of emails and things I actually need to respond to and send to people. So I do apologise if you're waiting for a response from me. I have basically been slowly catching up because it's amazing how me being ill for even a short amount of time and not, not doing that much, has an impact on the amount on my inbox. Also, hello to, well, I'm going to hopefully pronounce this Schutsche right. I could be pronouncing that completely wrong, but that's Chutche. And I've just had it flash up going, I've got a new support up. So, hello, Schutsche. Yes, I do have a spirit level in here. Let's be honest, of the things I have in my office, which do kind of indicate that I am still building sections of the office, the spirit level is one of the more normal things to have in here, considering all the shelves. 4, 5. That's the more fun thing. But that's in here because, frankly, if we don't have it in here under lock and key, my sister tries to use it. And I love her dearly, but her using this should be registered as a lethal weapon. Not in terms of intentionally lethal. Just carrying it, she took out 3 pots. She was talking on the phone while carrying it and just, you know, going da 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 da. I love her dearly. She is, please note again, please note, a really, really good engineer. She is. We tend to have a Discord chat afterwards where basically, because I don't sleep anyway, so I stay in here chatting until I go in and check the dogs and move to my evening repose position, and talk through the topic, but also sometimes talk through other things as well with people who want to chat a chat. I'm happy to answer questions. There are lots of things in Norway. Norway is an interesting scenario from many perspectives. I have to admit, though, I've been recording at the same time 3 different videos over the course of the last few days. I've been recording the Norway Long Patrol, I've been recording 21st Century Sea Power, and I've been recording Key Ships Orion Class, which is supposed to be tomorrow's video, and will be tomorrow's video. But I think I'm going to re-record it again tomorrow. As immediately, the moment I mentioned that my sister's an engineer, and, of course, her handling of the hammer, there are, of course, numerous builders and other people already in the chat going, yes, engineers should never be allowed anywhere near tools. I'm not saying I agree with you. I'm not saying I disagree with you. I'm just saying that for my own safety, it is better for me not to get involved in that discussion. Nice, Aaron. I've seen your suggestion, but honestly there was an easier way for me to write it through. And an easier way which actually had more of an interesting outcome. Because storm surges, freak weather, I have to then factor in and, you know, work that through. Whereas, honestly, I move one sailing order ahead by roughly 6 hours. Actually, no. I tell a lie. By roughly 16 hours is probably better than 6 hours. You can do it with 6 hours, but 16 hours will do it better. And the German fleet gets wiped out. Now, it does change everything. I will say that now. This is one of those topics which is cumulative. And a long patrol, I use the phrase cumulative. I don't know. I think in one of the videos I recorded, I went through and listened to it through and counted it back, and I used the word cumulative about 120 times in 90 minutes. I'm also going to say this before we get into this. Okay, I'm realizing I'm at roughly the 10-minute mark, and I'm getting into this, but this is a live video. Okay, when I interact with the chat and I talk with the chat. There are roughly 4 people who seem to regularly watch my videos. And all 4 on the lives will comment variations on theme of, this was disjointed, you keep going off, this is not a continuous presentation, That's because I'm interacting and answering questions from the chat. It's how you deal with it, and how you answer it, how I've been taught as a lecturer to deal with it and answer it. If you are talking, because I treat these chats like I do seminars, because there's an interaction going on. I tend to get, when I give a lecture, of course, I'm not interrupted. But that's what I do in the long patrols, the recorded videos, because there is no chance for interaction. at that point, because it's a recorded video, and then the interaction comes afterwards through to comments. So, all I will say is, I do see the 4 of yours comments. Go watch the long patrols, the recorded videos. Hopefully you'll like them more. And if you still don't like them, as much as I love people watching my videos, if you continually find you do not enjoy my videos, then might I suggest you go watch other accounts. There is Jamie Seedale's Armoured Carriers. There is my good friend Drakinafel account. There is lots of excellent naval history done in lots of different ways. One of the joyous things we have about YouTube is we have a multitude of people presenting history. And therefore a multitude of different methodologies. And yes, some methodologies are going to be more popular than others. Some are going to strike a chord with more people than others. But the thing is, the difference means that for every single person, for every single different learning way there is an opportunity out there for you. There is someone out there for you to go to. Please, go find yours. Instead of continually upsetting yourself by watching, I would argue, the version of the videos of mine which you are least likely to enjoy. Because all I do is see you getting worked up in the comments and feel honestly sad for you. Because I feel like you're wasting your lives watching a video which you're never going to enjoy because you don't like this style of interaction. That's fine. That's on you. So, without much further ado, click forward on the end. There you go. Shim's book log. Now, there are some people I still have a list of who I owe copies of books to. And so I have that list. And when these arrive, when the second edition arrives, the paperback version arrive, I will go to my list. And the ones who have not received copies from the first edition, that were on my list of people to receive books, will be receiving them. So please make sure, if you knew I was, say that you were on this next batch, if you've changed your address and changed details like that, make sure I have your address details. I keep my word. Okay? And thank you very much everyone who's buying this and everyone who's ordering this, because frankly, if it wasn't for the people supporting the YouTube channel, it wasn't for the patrons, it wasn't for everyone. And the thing is, one of the reasons I've delayed putting forward starting the vote for this for November's patron choice is because this week I've had all sorts of new people joining the patron, and I wanted to give them time to put in their suggestions. Some have, some haven't. But it seems to be through, and I was also not feeling well, so I didn't do it on Monday like I was planning to do, or Sunday or Monday like I was planning to do. I was going, oh, okay, I'll do it later in the week. I'll do it Tuesday. I'll do it, Wednesday sometime. And then people have joined the channel, have joined the Patreon. Thank you very much. But I've given, that's why I haven't started the vote yet, because I wanted to give them time to put in their ideas. But I will be starting the vote probably tomorrow. And I'll run it through till next Thursday. So it'll be running from the 20th to the 26th. No. Yeah, the 20th to the 26th. And that's the plan. So thank you very much, everyone. Because if it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for your support, I certainly wouldn't be able to keep doing this. So, what is our scenario for victory? Oh, fun times. Paul, I just answered a quick question on the channel. So, if you're sitting and like to be watching at any point, no, my sister doesn't watch videos. To be fair, when she's asked, the response from my cousins who do watch the videos has been, He's always very polite about you and scrupulously honest, and in many ways actually tones down some of your capers. So she doesn't watch. I did love it. My aunt, yet she used the phrase, he tones down your capers. My aunt, by the way, that is the aunt who makes the bets about whether or not I'm going to reach, and has currently got the bet of whether I get to 15,000 subscribers or not. She does watch on a regular basis. I have now worked out. And she's actually a subscriber to the channel. So she does watch, she does subscribe, and she does know everything that's said about her. And doesn't care. Absolutely loves it. Her actual thing she's encouraging me at the moment is try and get a gig being an academic on a cruise. So she has a reason to do another cruise next year. That's her entire thing. She's going, I'm not supposed to do any more cruises next year, you know. Your uncle thinks that we shouldn't do more than one a year. However, if you were going on one as the, you know, the speaker, well, we'd have to come to support you, wouldn't we? Okay. Aunts, they are special. They are really special. So, what is our scenario for victory? Well, the scenario is going to depend if the German troops never land, and if they do land. Because if they don't land, then there is a good chance the Norwegian government may well try to stay neutral. They might be very pro-British neutral, but they will probably try and stay neutral. If the German forces do not land in Germany, I can see the Norwegians trying to stay neutral. If they land and actually kill Norwegians, then the scenario changes. Because, let's be honest, the Norwegian government is in many ways saved from their own policy failures by the fact that Norway is taken. In that no one's caught, they are able to go, right, and we don't want to fight an active war because of the fear of the reprisals the Germans will take in Norway. We don't want to fight an active conflict. Which you can understand. And that, in many ways, is one of the reasons why they take the approach they do with Carl Gustav Fleischer and the various others in terms of trying to pick senior officers who are going to be more moderate in their approach. But if the Germans landed, killed Norwegians, were forced off and kicked out of Norway, and the Norwegian government then turned around to their populace and went, well, you know, now we want to go for a neutral approach to war, I think they'd been in significant trouble. The next thing this topic doesn't change is one of the things that's very difficult to change is Norway will not, the fate of Norway does not affect the fate of France. It was really interesting to work this through, but I did it on a tabletop scenario with literally a tabletop game drawn out and chucking dice. I did it on a computer-based scenario, thanks to some software a friend loaned me. And I worked it through as what I would call an oral discussion. Now, basically, that's when you sit down with a couple of very other knowledgeable people and you sit there and you work it through. But it's not quite a discussion. It's a discursion, because you're mentally going for a wander around places. So it's a kind of a trip. And And I was taught that phrase, I have to admit, by a very old historian a long time ago. So I sat down and I was having the chat through with them. And the thing is, no matter how badly Germany did in Norway, no matter how much their forces got completely bushwhacked, there is no way we could make the French army any better prepared. There is no way we could change the positions on the ground in France. And the thing is, the French army faces the same issues. Now, there is a sort of psychological point. Does the fact that the Germans fail in Norway give the French government more of a confidence, more elan, more conviction in their their actions? The trouble is, no, it doesn't. There's no way it can't do that because of France, basically, the French government, the way it's set up at the time. So, no. It just won't have an impact. Peter Dawson, have you read No Highway by Naval? The name rings a bell, but I'm not sure if I have. If that makes sense. It's one of those things of... See, I've got a book looking at me which is Devil's Highway, but I don't think that's not No Highway, but I think I also read No Highway. But I'm not 100% sure. It rings a bell, though. Oh, Flyface BC. What an interesting premise. It's a good one from the patrons. Oh, I actually am quite lucky with the patron vote. I'd say, with the patron suggestions and patron vote, I too tend to get pretty good topics. Pete Olson, we'll get into that. So, the scenario therefore is, well, it seems only fair that I should discuss, the idea of a pro-Britain neutral. This is a pro-Britain neutral Sweden. Neutral Norway, I mean. Because it would be pro-Britain, broadly speaking. If Germany, even if they are using the fact that Germany didn't actually manage to land troops and therefore to stay neutral, there's going to be significant forces in Norway which are going to be pro-Britain after us. And a lot of the people who are pro-German are probably going to find themselves deployed to very cold places. Now, starting point. If Germany's failed to invade Norway, there's no need to invade Iceland. And whilst there's a theoretical option of potentially having to invade Denmark, you probably won't have to. In fact, what you might secure with both Denmark and Iceland and Norway and Sweden going neutral is try and push them to form some sort of neutral guarantor. So you might end up actually with Swedish and Norwegian troops being deployed to Denmark and Iceland to act as their guarantors of neutrality and independence in the war. That would be a really interesting thing, but it's a possibility. It's an option out there. Something I haven't really discussed in Long Patrol because, well, I was keeping the Long Patrols to roughly 90 minutes in length. But it is an option. It is something which is out there. Britain is able to access Swedish iron ore via Narvik. Germany won't be able to access it via Narvik, but Britain will be. This is going to have an impact on British production. But it's also going to mean that Britain can do a de facto blockade of Swedish iron ore from getting to Germany. How does it do this? Well, the same way Britain has done blockades in the past. You see, people always think of blockades as being these things where we go to war, where we use force. We go, you hand it to me or I will take it off you. Got the point of a sword. Yeah, give it. Actually, it's not. More often than not, the person who came aboard would be a very nicely spoken officer who would have, you know, I don't have a pen. I'm dyslexic, dysgraphic, who doesn't actually do much handwriting, so I have a straw instead. Please don't. And I'll tell you, I have a little sheet. I'll note down everything. Its value. And they turn around to the captain and go, so, this is a check. We'd like to buy all your goods. And the captain will go, and if I say no, then we'll follow out the other part of our orders. Yes, I'll take the check. Thank you very much. How does this work with Sweden being neutral and Norway being neutral? Well, if you've still got the supplies able to come from Norway, to an extent it doesn't even matter if they're sunk coming from Norway. What matters is you stop the supplies getting to Germany. And I'll get into that. But you can just buy it. You can go there and you can buy the ore. You can keep on buying it. And that's what they can do. And then Germany either has to pay the money to try and get into a bidding war with the British, or they don't get the ore. And if you're Sweden, here is the other problem on that front, okay? If you're Sweden, and Germany just failed to invade Norway, and so are looking, and have invaded Denmark. Remember, they invade Denmark the same day they're attacking Norway. Literally, the fact the invasion of Denmark should have been the wake-up call to the Norwegian government to send all forces to maximum alert. But no, they didn't. But the Swedish government did go to maximum alert. The Swedish government expected the Germans to try and invade them as well. Literally, the Germans crossed the border into Norway, and within 20 minutes, it seems, their orders are going around Sweden, activating their reserves and sending their troops up. It's disturbingly quick how fast some of their forces get activated and get called up. It's almost as if they've been waiting for it. And waiting for the orders. Now, if you're thinking about that and you're Sweden, you're going to think, well, hang on. We've got neutral Norway on one side, and the British wanting to buy iron ore, and if the British were going to do anything to us, they'd have to get through neutral Norway and past the Germans. Whereas the Germans have tried to invade Norway, have invaded Denmark. Who would you prefer to supply iron ore to if you have the choice? Or rather, would you supply just enough to Germany that you could say you were neutral, while using the same excuse, you know, the Portuguese used the old alliance, the historical alliance, the Treaty Perpetual Alliance, for the reason of them letting the Allies use the Azores. All sorts of things come out. Would you as Sweden go, oh, sorry, but the British have bid more money. The British are paying more, so we're selling to them. We're neutral. We'll sell it to whoever pays the most money, and the British are paying the most money. And send the most of the iron, bulk of the iron ore through Narvik to Norway. Not through Norway to Britain, to America. Now, we'll be discussing later, because, of course, the main scenario we're going to discuss is, of course, if Norway was invaded and wins and how that turns out. So we're going to be getting into what the British could be using the iron ore for, etc. later. So I'm not going to get into that too much in this slide. But things continue on, because bases like Rosyth and Scapa Flow will now be pretty much beyond German reach. Glasgow will be pretty much beyond German bomber reach. If you consider what bombers the Germans have, and how few very long-range bombers they have, the vast majority of their bombing aircraft are medium-range aircraft. They need the Norwegian bases to be able to reach northern Britain. Especially if they want to be able to get past the fighter defences, etc., that exist in the southern part of Britain. So you have the problem that, yes, you can theoretically reach them from down here, but you will have to go across the fighters here, 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 here to get to there. Or you can come across the North Sea, where there's only one layer of fighters between you and the target. You can come across the North Sea. If you can't use the North Sea, your Norwegian bases, you can't operate. It's the same with the submarines. You no longer have access to those submarine bases. You no longer have the ability to use the fjords, to use the channels along the coast of Norway, to use all these things to get your ships out. So all that has an impact. The North Sea anti-submarine warfare surface radar barrier can be affected, with hunter groups and long-range patrol aircraft making the Battle of Atlantic far more difficult. Because again, the point is, we're going to get into this, especially when discussing it from the perspective of an allied Norway. German submarines, if they cruise mostly to get their longest ranges, cruise out on the surface. They spend a lot of their time on the surface, heading out to patrol. If they have to go for significant distances in the North Sea underwater, life becomes far, far more complicated. If they're having to spend their time underwater in the North Sea, if they have to spend their entire time getting out into the Atlantic underwater, or only surfacing very quickly for very short periods of time, they're in trouble. And remember, we're talking about a period long before the snorkel comes into widespread use in the German Navy. Now, you also have the fact that for the British, from the perspective of defending against surface raiders, well, again, suddenly you don't have to worry so much about the GI-UK gap. That becomes a secondary gap. That becomes something you're patrolling for anything that gets through your primary defensive gap, which is going to be your North Sea gap. And if you have long-range maritime patrol aircraft wandering out, watching the North Sea, if you have maybe some civilian watchers with binoculars and radios sitting in Norway, able to make a nice phone call and go, yes, I have seen that the Bismarck is running in tomorrow's race. She looks very sprightly. It might be 20 furlongs. She'll be able to race for. That's enough information. You've got also the opportunity of laying mines, and you've got the fact, again, for the submarines, it's not just going out from North Sea to go out to patrol, it's coming back. So it becomes a zone where when they go through, they are going to be losing subs. It is going to be costing them assets. And also you've got the fact that the British are, if the Germans never make it, and it's basically the same scenario I'm using for why the Germans don't make it, as whether they don't make it entirely or they don't make it to carry out most of the invasion. The thing is, that's going to have an effect on British losses and German ships available. That losing the Norway campaign is going to have an effect on their ability to operate. And if they can't... Also, let's be honest from the get-go. If Norway doesn't fall, if Norway's a neutral country, Sweden's a neutral country, the odds... The Arctic convoys change from being these absolute environments where the Germans can chuck aircraft, Schnellboats, large surface combatants, and U-boats at them, to things they can chuck pretty much nothing at. Think about that. Arctic convoys, where they are sailing away from the German area of operations instead rather than along or round the German area of operations, which are sailing away from the German ability to intercept. Basically, the only time they will be most at risk from German intercept when they're British ports. And if you start by running the convoys from places like Halifax in Nova Scotia to the Soviet Union, they might never go into anywhere within range of German U-boat operations, aircraft operations, anything. They might be completely out of it for the entirety of their effort. That's going to have an impact. And of course, we do talk about Swedish iron ore. Well, let's consider the actual value of Swedish iron ore. Swedish iron ore accounted for roughly 43% of the iron ore used in Germany between 1933 and 1943. That's a rough stat that gives you an idea. These stats, by the way, all come from Rolf Carbon's 1965 work, Sweden's Iron Ore Exports to Germany. It covers 1933 to 1944. It's from the Scandinavian Economic History Review, and it's well worth looking up. The details are all here. And 28.2% was produced domestically, 12.9% came from France, and the remainder from other sources, including the British Empire. But that's not the biggest part of it. Swedish iron ore is very high quality. It's very high on the purity scale. This makes it far easier than the German or the French sources to use for high-end quality products and quality steels. This is going to, if these supplies are going to Britain, they will help tremendously in armour production and gun barrel production, because that's exactly what you need those things for. But you're talking about 70% of the iron ore that goes into German armaments and armour manufacture at certain points is coming from Swedish sources. 70%. Because of the purity. And their mills and stuff are set up to receive ore of that purity. So, in order to adapt those mills to receive ore of differing purity, you have to put in all sorts of systems to help them filter out the impurities. Which means they're going to take longer. And it's using to actually produce anything, but it's also going to mean it's going to take more energy to produce, which is going to affect another area of your market. And most importantly, you've still got a lot less ore. You've got roughly 40% less ore. Think about how that's going to affect German war production. People have already talked about subs. Think about tanks. Think about anything that requires armour. Think about the quality of steel that goes into barrels, rifles, all those things. And yes, you can still get ore. Iron ore is to an extent iron ore, and you can purify iron ore, but you've lost a lot of your supplies. And there's Norwegian aluminium to build aircraft. You're quite right. There's all sorts of materials as well from Norway. There's oils, lubricants, all sorts of things come from Scandinavia that Germany depends on. And the thing is, if those nations are both neutral, Britain can buy as much as they want from it. And the thing is, again, I would say this, Norway is going to be the level of neutral which Sweden was, which means if you go into their waters and they detect you, they're going to blast first, ask questions later, which is going to serve the British well. Because if you've got the Norwegians hunting down submarines hanging around near their coast, that's going to help the British. See, Clarke, how much of their supply of other metals also came from Scandinavia? That is a debatable number. There is a lot of stuff which comes from Scandinavia, heavy water and all sorts of other things. In terms of aluminium, I'm going to have to look it up on my basically, the Norwegian industry in 1940 was producing 12,000 metric tons per year of alumina and 37,000 metric tons per year of aluminium in 1940. When the Germans invaded, they increased the capacity of alumina, which is a subproduct, to 330,000 metric tons per year, and aluminium to up to 180,000 metric tons per year. This is mainly thanks to, of course, the hydraulic power which is available and the electricity and harbour facilities which are available in Norway. So this is the reason I haven't gone into aluminium as much, is because the thing is, you then have to work out, well, would the Norwegians be expanding as much? Would the British pay for the Norwegians to expand as much as the Germans did? Or would the demand from Britain pay for its expansion? Would it expand to the same level? Would it expand more? Would it expand less? Those are so many different butterflies to work out. But either way, Germany isn't getting that aluminium. And Britain will be getting the aluminium. So that could cause an interesting impact on things. And yes, there's also tungsten, molybdenum, nickel, all sorts of materials, again, which they are going to be short of. They don't get all their supplies from Scandinavia, for most of those materials, but they do get a large amount of their supplies from Scandinavia. Now, Mishran, what I've said was, in a nicer way, this is a scenario where they try to invade, but they don't actually manage to land. Okay, Bitron? And also, the Norwegian government is still the Norwegian government. I haven't changed the Norwegian government for this scenario. The Norwegian government was prepared to try and stick in their heads in the sand for everything to try and avoid being in part of the war. So, yeah. I was asking, would Britain be able to afford all that ore? Britain would find a way. With the help of Canada, India, all the dominions, I'm fairly sure they'd find a way. I'm also fairly certain that a large number of American financiers might also help out. Let's be honest. This is going to sound strange, but I could see a lot of people in America thinking a very easy way to make sure Hitler never becomes a problem for America, allowing them to concentrate on the Pacific, is to make sure his industry doesn't have the materials he needs. So that works in their favour. Britain already has a lot of money. And Britain is able to afford it. Plus, you have to remember, under this scenario, Britain is going to have other advantages to play around with. BlackburnMaximus, could they buy merchant ships off a neutral Sweden? The trouble is, to buy merchant ships off Sweden, Maximus, you need to get them out of the Baltic. So you could perhaps get chartered the neutral companies of Sweden to send their ships to Narvik to help transport ore across the North Sea, but they would have to get them out of the Baltic. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Germans try and stop them. I don't think the Mosquito will be made of aluminium. I think the reason, one of the reasons why the Mosquito is as the Mosquito is to take advantage of the wider British industry. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of resources found for that aluminium. I would say on the bankruptcy, you're looking at when Britain finally goes bankrupt. It's not directly World War Two. There's been a lot of mismanagement post World War Two as well, and so you've been hit by World War One. You've been hit by the Great Depression. You've been hit by World War Two, and then you've had a lot of mismanagement from all governments of all colours post World War Two, and then you have things like the Suez Crisis, etc., and a few other things, and basically, yeah, like it happens. Does this affect Italy? Well, the thing is, you're all kind of jumping ahead on the points, and in neutral, then in this scenario, I'm not sure if a neutral Norway really affects Italy as much, but I think the next scenario would be more interesting. And again, as said, it would give Britain multiplicity of sources. It also means I would also add this. Even in this scenario, those resources not going to Germany and going to Britain instead are going to weaken Germany to a large extent. Germany has already far more limitations on their infrastructure in many ways than Britain does, as I've discussed before. Maritime infrastructure is a good example of this, but various other areas in terms of infrastructure, they are at a disadvantage to Britain. They have strengths, but they have weaknesses, and one of their big weaknesses is they are dependent on a lot more. They are dependent on imports just as much as Britain is, but they are far more easier to cut off from the global economy than Britain is. For Britain to cut off Germany, then Germany to cut off Britain. And as Karl Gasberg pointed out, buying ore is cheaper than it takes to kill the equivalent amount of steel in the form of panzers and all those things. Yes, it's a lot cheaper to buy this material and use that material to build your own equipment. Again, this is going to speed up British production and British construction of things. Because, again, think about it from this. Think about the import distance of importing from Norway versus importing from America. You're talking convoys which are a couple of days long, which will be under air cover the entire way, which will be very easy to escort. Hello, Kai. Hello, Utah. There are lots of different options. And ball bearings, of course, yes. So, it's all going to build up. What effect does this have on the war in terms of length? Well, that's a big problem to work out, because it's all about resource allocation. And it makes the North Atlantic battle a lot more difficult for the Germans. It makes the Arctic convoys a lot easier from the Allied perspective in terms of supplying Russia, and Soviet Union. And it, in terms of resources, means resources are coming from a shorter distance away to support going to Britain's industry, and will be able to come in quite large quantities at a key time, which enables British industry to grow more to be able to grow more quickly, while the Germans are still working up their own infrastructure, which will hopefully mean British industry can work up a bit faster as well. So it's all an interesting cumulative impact, and honestly, this one is one of the more difficult ones to work out the likely scenario of. I think you probably get a different scenario in the Mediterranean still, because of what I'm going to discuss next. So, the invasion fails. How have I got the invasion failing? And, of course, Knight 6831 came up with the idea of a big storm. Nah. As much as it would probably sink quite a lot of the German cruisers, that wasn't really what I wanted and didn't really work out viably. Because if they get sunk in a storm, You have to have a storm suddenly appear from somewhere, which means you have to change a lot of things. And you have to change a lot of to get the storm to appear and for them to sail into the storm because of weather reports and all those things. It's just a lot of difficulty to work out. Whereas if you look at some of the timings here, if you shift some of the Royal Navy movements, well, back a little bit, and I'm talking really little bit, 6 hours or so, you find them in some very interesting places. You shift them back 12, 16 hours, they have an amazingly interesting different cases. And so let's start considering this. The forces for Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik, which are significant forces, run into the home fleet, which at one point when it's sailing has Rodney, Valiant, Renown, Repulse, roughly 6 Royal Navy cruisers, 1 French cruiser, 32 Royal Navy destroyers including 8 tribal class, and 2 French destroyers in a rough grouping. Think about that force for a starting point. HMS Rodney, HMS Valiant, one of the upgraded Queen Elizabeth class, remember? And Renown, upgraded, and Repulse. That's not a good group to run. 6 Royal Navy cruisers and a French cruiser. It's a roughly even split between heavy cruisers and light cruisers, the light cruisers being town class mostly. "32 Royal Navy destroyers, including 8 tribal class destroyers. The Royal Navy's destroyer-killing destroyers. You know, destroyers come from torpedo boat destroyers. Well, these are destroyers. 2 French destroyers as well. That's a fairly hefty group. On top of that, the German... wait for Warspite. The Germans are laden with troops and ammunition, and they're still on the orders to try and protect Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. Now, admittedly, the first admiral who goes out with them is more aggressive than the second one. He's more aggressive, he is more likely to fight, but even he's not stupid enough to try and fight that force. And that's a problem for him. What does he do? What's his option? What can he do to change the results? Well, his only real option is going to be, because let's be honest, the U-boats are still going to have the same problems they did historically with their torpedoes. Same problems they did historically. So they're just as useless as they were historically. It's going to be chuck his light forces at the British, which is going to be suicidal, while he tries to run away. And what the British will probably do is use their light forces and Rodney and Valiant to hoover up the German light forces, while they go to Repulse and Renown hunt. 2 of the very ships which can actually are fast enough to catch Scharnhorst and Eisenhower. And they will be hunting them. Now, Renown versus Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, that ended up with Scharnhorst and Eisenhower both getting some damage. Add in Repulse, you've got even more firepower going. Yes, she's not modernized. But the thing is, at the same timing you're talking about this, if you've got those 2 chasing them, then they are going to probably run into something called HMS Warspite coming up from the south, because of where she's positioned, roughly at this time. So you've got if you move forward these commands a few hours so that they leave earlier, then Warspite's going to be heading up slightly earlier. So Warspite will be in a position. So you could end up with a fight where Scharnhorst and Eisenhower have got Repulse and Renown on one side and Warspite on the other side. There is no scenario in that where I see both of those ships getting away. There are very few scenarios where one gets away. I'm generous in this scenario, and I'm going to say Scharnhorst gets away. But I honestly don't think they both get away. I honestly think the odds are that between Warspite, Renown, and Repulse, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau get sunk, and the Germans end up losing 2 capital ships, 7 cruisers, and 14 destroyers in one day. And you don't need to change much, because the British government is actually debating when to send out the home fleet and when to send that force out. They send it out when they do on the 7th. But they could have sent it out the morning of the 7th. And if they'd sent it out, let's say 1100 hours on the 7th, 8 hours earlier, if you start looking at those maps, you start to see there's lots of positions where they would be interacting and hitting those forces. And they could well be bumping into the ones from Bergen. Now, the scenario then after that is quite simple, because Bijon reckon that in the nicest way, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are not battle cruisers. They are battleships. The fact is they are built with 11-inch guns because those are the biggest the Germans can build at a time. Not because they're building battle cruisers. They are fast battleships. That's what they're designed as. They are probably the best design the Germans come up with in the World War II scenario, but yeah, in terms of efficiency. But leaving that to one side, what would then happen? Well, you've got Carl Gustav Fleischer up north with all his troops up north in the Tromsø area and above that. And the Royal Navy probably turn around to go, would you like to move south? And we'll get you south. So they will move him south while there are fights going in Oslo, Kristiansand, and so probably land him in Trondheim or so maybe even Bergen so he can come across and get into the fight as quickly as possible. They will land, because they'll be treating it as an allied operation for their covers, the British and French forces will be landed as under a senior major general. Who's the most senior major general at the moment? There. Major General Carton de Weert. So next to your scenario, you've got Carl Gustav Fleischer and Carton de Weert tag teaming with forces to attack the German forces down in the south, while the Royal Navy, who have, let's be honest, have just wiped out their German counterparts, will be doing their best to seal off the south. Yes, there'll probably be German air attacks going on, but let's be honest, it's not going to be the same as the scenario where the Germans already got a foothold. The Germans haven't got any footholds in any parts of Norway other than the south, and they're fighting in the south. Then their ability to overwhelm the Norwegian forces is gone, because Norwegians are able to withdraw in the inland and start mobilizing their forces, and they probably still lost the vessels they lost originally in the attacks on those places and the stuff they've lost. So, in the nicest way, the Germans at this point are on the back foot. And British destroyers will probably be going into Vingersund and Kristiansand and attacking the German ships in there. So the British destroyers will be doing destroyer attacks straight into there. They might even, let's be honest, it's the tribal class. They might even end up doing mass tribal class flotilla going up the fjord into Oslo. It leaves Bismarck and Tirpitz still fitting out. But remember, Bismarck doesn't finish its trials and things. And there's a reason it doesn't deploy before May 1941. So, in a nice way, for the rest of 1940, Germany wouldn't have anything. So, yeah, this is it. Norway gets one. Now, I think that's a fairly sensible thing. And as I said, it's fairly logical for me, because the Allies would want that to look like it was a Norway victory, so they couldn't send a lieutenant general. They couldn't send anyone senior, so they've got to go to the most senior major general they have available. That is Carton de Weert. He's acceptable to both the British, the French, and the Norwegians. So, as I said, it makes sense. So, the whole way through, I'm trying to sort of argue what is the sensible scenario. Guys, one half to war game scenario. Since in the historic version, magnetic fuses saved a lot of British bacon, but a lot of this scenario is based on the fact, as I said, there are 30 U-boats in this scenario, and in pretty much every exercise version I run, because I've got the torpedoes put into their reliability as historical accurate a scenario they're having a nightmare. They are literally firing. You know, there's a good example is Warspite, which was fired at about 6 or 7 times in the fjord in Narvik, and she's hit a few times, and torpedoes don't go off. Let's mention, would they start building replacement channels? They couldn't. There is a reason why the Germans, the last ship they complete is Tirpitz. Look at their yards. Look at the amount of supplies going to the yards. And that's with Swedish iron ore reaching them. That's with Norwegian aluminium reaching them. If they're not getting any of that, there's no way any of their ships are being built. Like, were there ever anyone higher ranked than Major General in Norwegian Army? No. But it's not at this point. So there's no one higher ranked Major General. And when you've got the scenario, the government basically falling apart, the British are quite happy to deploy lieutenant generals and take over. When you are reinforcing the government to allow the Norwegians to drive the Germans back into the sea, you have to make sure you have the appropriate ranked officer involved. Take care, Frank Bamwell. Where I'm questioning, where did British UK get their army from? Did they import bauxite or refined metal? Bit of both. Mostly refined metal, because mostly they got it from... It came technically from Canada. Technically from Canada. And of course, HMS Glorious has survived. Butterflies going away from there. Ronan, did the German detonator have a backup to the contact detonator? Did they? I'm not sure, but they seem to have had all sorts of fun issues with it. That I haven't read on the specific marks of submarine torpedoes in a while. Veteran, I looked up Requiem, so it's a mirror for dead, but I was actually thinking of how Renown and Repulse sinking evil twins could redeem the battlecruiser in history, especially if Hood doesn't explode. Well, yes, in a nice way, Renown Repulse, but the thing is, if Warspite's there, I'm fairly sure Warspite gets a hefty dose of the credit. That's the trouble. The moment Warspite's there at the fight, let's be honest, who's going to get the credit? Is it Renown? Is it Repulse? No, Warspite going, I took them both down. Excuse me, we were there as well. Yeah, but I'm the Queen Elizabeth class, the upgraded Warspite. Everyone shall fear me. And also you have to consider the sheer amount of naval personnel and troops which they lose in this scenario. You're going to lose admirals, you're going to lose captains, you're going to lose all sorts of officers. And especially in the forces that the Germans are deploying, because they are officer heavy. Because they're still their pre-war force numbers. And no, Italy hasn't joined at this point in World War II, so Italy could be watching going, oh frigate, the German Navy just got wiped out. That's the other scenario, though, that's going to have an impact, because remember, this has just been a fight which has basically been between battleships, and it's decided in the Norway campaign it'll be considered. This was between capital ships. Yes, 2 battle cruisers, one modernised, one not, and one modernised battleship from World War I, but that's going to do it. Lots of people now working out Repulse is going to get ignored completely. It's going to be Wars by Renown getting golden BBs. Who knows? Okay, who knows what happens in that fight? But if you want to wargame it, you can. I don't see it as good scenario. Basically, you've got you've got Warspite coming from one side, Sharnos and Isa, and the trouble is they have limited maneuverability in terms of where they can go. I would say Hitler's pretty secure in his position at this point. I would say I don't think that the losing in Norway is going to cost Hitler anything. Especially not when he can blame it on Navy. I wouldn't be surprised if Radar is executed. And it could mean that their surface navy is wiped out at the beginning. There is a very real possibility of consequence of invasion fails, and I haven't discussed this from Long Patrol. Again, due to time, there's a very real possibility that Hitler basically deletes the surface fleet from that point onwards. He decides there's no point in them. So Bismarck and Tirpitz might never be finished. The thing about that, you have no Norwegian submarine bases for the U-boats. You have no surface fleet major surface raiders because they're all either sunk or no longer being crewed. And you have no air bases in Norway, etc. That's going to have a massive impact on the convoy war because, in the nicest way, if you have no need for for capital ships in home fleet waters, they're all going to be in the Mediterranean or they're going to be in the Far East. And the poor Duke of York won't get a look in later on because Sharnos and Eisenhower are probably gone. So, I have, though, been very conservative in my scenario. I have basically, in the scenario I've gone through from this point, I've said I've let Scharnhorst survive, and she's got back, and Bismarck and Tirpitz are still completed, because Hitler in 1940 is not the Hitler you're dealing with in 1943. Okay, he's been on a roll of victories, and to an extent he's less drugged up and more understanding. And Raider has more influence at that point. Raider is going to lose influence as time goes on, but he has more influence at that point. So, I think the things are still going on. And Winston Churchill has already paused the capital ship programs at this point. That's Winston Churchill. That has nothing to do with Norway. That was Winston Churchill pretty much. That was decision number 2 after he becomes first Lord of the Admiralty again. He was basically on World War I autopilot. Decision number 1 had to do with the way his office and desk were orientated in this office. However, I would say with all the iron ore and all that materials coming into the UK, one of the easiest things to do would be to use them for the capital ship projects. So I do think they get worked on. I just don't think I don't think they get paused as much. I think they get worked on. I think you might even see things like the Lions, etc., push forward because you've got the supplies. You've got the supplies. You're already buying them. You might as well use them. So, the war in Scandinavia. Now, this is an interesting scenario. I can foresee Germany bombing Norway. I really can. So one of the interesting conversations I had with people was they were going, well, it's going to make it easier on British Fighter Command because they won't have to have fighters to defend as much of the UK because the Germans can't attack from all the bases. Well, they're probably going to end up deploying fighters to Norway. They're probably also going to have to build radars in Norway. These are all going to be factors. There are going to have to be radars built in Norway. There are going to have to be fighters deployed to Norway. Norway's going to probably try and build their own aircraft or buy them from Sweden. But yeah. Does Churchill still come to power? He probably still does because France falls. In a nicer way, the French falling is probably going to bring Churchill to power. Now, I would say Norwegian and Swedish ore is not going to be going to Japan in this scenario, because in this scenario especially, in the neutral scenario there was an option, but the British would probably still be buying it. In the nicest way, Japan would not be able to pay the figures that the British and the Germans would be willing to pay. So they would be priced out of the ore in the neutral scenario. In this scenario, well, Norway's going to be helping Britain with that purchasing of Swedish ore. And Sweden's possibly going to be even more keen on the idea of Britain having the ore rather than Germany. After all, Germany didn't just try to, but actually invaded and was repulsed from their neighbour. They could well be buying aircraft from the US and etc. But there are facilities and things to manufacture stuff in Sweden. So this is do not forget the Swedish industrial base. I think, yes, it's likely that Norway takes up some of the French orders of aircraft instead of necessarily the British getting them, which might mean actually that the Norwegians end up operating Wildcats in defence of Norway in the battle of the Battle of Norway part, a sort of section like congruent to the Battle of the Atlantic, Battle of Britain, which could be interesting. It also means Britain doesn't have Wildcats for its own carriers, but we'll leave that one side. The other scenario you have going on in terms of Scandinavia is I would see Finland maybe going neutral rather than invading the Soviet Union. They're not so much caught between their options being Germany or the Soviet Union. They're not caught with what they can't. They're not facing just one or the other. They have an actual scenario on their hands where they have an actual third way. They could join the Allies, or they could be neutral like Sweden, and masculinely neutral like Sweden, and tacitly keep good relations and balance all three. It becomes a three-way discussion rather than a two-way discussion, and Finland can balance that. Now, the thing is, this is the traditional ore imports you see actually through the history of stuff going through Narvik versus through Luleå in the Baltic. And Narvik traditionally goes down because of the British efforts to stop the ore getting from Narvik out. And Narvik's critical for when the Baltic ices up, etc. And the electric train going across. There's also the aluminium and all the other things, okay? All their stuff matters. That ore flowing out of Scandinavia is going to be a critical thing going into the industries. Industry in Britain, industry elsewhere. It's going to allow you to supply things. If you've got the raw materials coming in and you're able to move the raw materials in and keep those supply chains going, because again, those supply chains have been part of the British construction program for a long time. So one of the issues you have in World War II is the disruption of some of the traditional supply chains and the issues that cause in terms of delays in manufacture. If you have less disruption because you're able to keep the supply chains going, even if they are disrupted in terms of timetable, but not in terms of sourcing new stuff and adapting to the different peculiarities of that particular quality of ore, etc., you will actually have a far more stable production. Now, Norway, it's going to sound strange when I'm talking about Churchill, because as I said, well, he still becomes leader of the country at the same timeline. It's not going to be necessarily a Norway failure, it's going to be a Norway success. He probably brings him to power, but also there's still going to be issues with France. So I see him becoming Prime Minister. It might be delayed, it might be the fall of France, which makes him Prime Minister. It might be other thing. It might be the success of Norway, but I still see Churchill becoming it, because honestly, Chamberlain put all his efforts into trying to buy time for Britain to prepare for war. And he wanted more time. And he's a bit of a spent force, personally and politically, by the time war actually begins. So it only requires one or so crisis, and it happens. I'd also say the Royal Navy hasn't lost Glorious. They haven't lost Glowworm. There are lots of things they won't have lost in the same scenarios. I would add, though, they have lost some vessels, but the Germans lost a lot more. And now we've got Scandinavia. Now I'd also see torpedo boats going to Scandinavia, going to Norwegian war, operating from Norway. So the Skagerrak is going to become infested with British torpedo boats and Norwegian torpedo boats. I would see British submarines operating from there, which means they're going to be able to get right off the German coast, right off the Danish coast, right into the Baltic. So British submarines are going to be able to get into the Baltic by navigating through the Denmark Straits. British aircraft will be operating from there. Remember, we've talked before about the Swordfish, but there's also the Beaufighter and Blenheim and other aircraft from Bristol, etc., which are going to be incredibly useful hunting down ships in the Baltic, etc., and operating off the coast of Germany from Norway. And basically, Scandinavia is going to be a hotbed of the war. It's going to be a very, very big issue. British commando raids in the Baltic Sea. You could well see British commando operations getting into the Baltic. I think you're right. Chamberlain is also dying of cancer at this point. At some point, he's going to have to step down. It might only be a few months he can move out of crisis. Yes, so I don't see anyone else really rising to take up Churchill's place, and especially if Churchill has won. The Soviet Union historically, how do I put this politely? They were fighting Japan in 1939, and that's why they didn't invade Poland at the same time as Germany did. And they'd already fought a war versus Finland and learnt that the Finnish were very good at fighting a winter war. So I don't think they necessarily want to get involved in this scenario. And at this point, they're still on the wrong side of history. So you've got supplies coming out there. You've also got war fighting going on. I could see this being a very interesting scenario in terms of the government's mobilization. But I could also see it being very interesting in terms of for the Germans, because actually attacking Norway is a very difficult prospect to bomb. Especially if you're trying to go up its length rather than coming at it from its side. Remember, Norway is, if we go back to an earlier map of it, Norway, as you can see, is very long, very deep that way, not very deep that way. So the German angle of aircraft, especially if they can't fly across Sweden, muscular neutrality, like Switzerland, you will not fly over them, they will shoot you down. Well, Trondheim, etc., and a lot of spaces can be well beyond the range of Germans to get involved in. And this is going to give them strength. And then you get into the war in Northern Europe. Well, this is the point, one of the small points I want to make. Oslo to Berlin is 521 miles versus London to Berlin is 580 miles. Oslo Ploesti, the heart of Romanian oil fields, is 1,212 miles from London, from Oslo. It's 1,280 miles from London. Why does this matter? Well, that means it's roughly a 2,430 mile trip there and back from Oslo. From London, it's 2,560 miles. One is flying mostly across Poland and Romania, which do not have the best German air defense, etc. One is flying over the Ruhr Valley and all sorts of fun things, which are heavily defended. What's the point? Well, a Vickers Wellington is capable of Vickers Wellington, which is the most produced of these three aircraft, would do 2,550 miles. That's their maximum range, fully loaded. Whitley was Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, 1,650 miles. Handley Page Hampton, 1,720 miles. So, in simple terms, all three of them can hit Berlin from any of those options. All three of them can hit Berlin from any of those options. However, Vickers Wellingtons can start hitting the Romanian oil fields from Norway. Now, why is this going to have an impact? Well, because we've been so far talking about supplies coming from Norway to Britain in terms of raw resources. But if you're covering convoys going backwards and forwards, and I'll get into this when talking about the North Sea, which I think is the next slide, because slowly I'm going out from Scandinavia to the rest of the world. So Northern Europe is closer to Scandinavia than UK is, so I'm working through it that way. If you've got supplies convoys going back and forwards anyway to move those supplies, you can might as well take a lot of food, ammunition, etc. for your bombers. And if you get that to Trondheim, you can get it from Trondheim down to the Oslo area, and you can launch from the Oslo area. You could actually go slightly more southerly than that if you wanted. But if you're launching from Oslo and you fly down the Skagerrak and across Poland, etc., you can skirt a lot of German air defences, and skirt the Swedish ones as well, and you can hit those oil fields. Now, those oil fields account for a tremendous percentage of German oil. At times in World War II, they are not only the most reliable, but pretty much the only ones which are actually viably supplying German industry and the German ability to fight. More importantly than that, those oil fields are critical because there are a number of German refineries which are orientated around the qualities of oil which comes from those fields. You take them out, you hit them hard enough, early enough, and you keep hitting them, and that's going to cripple German industry. They haven't got the supplies Britain has. Now the thing is, again, someone said you're going to lose a lot of planes, but think about it from this perspective. You're going to lose a lot of planes if you flew it across this way because you're flying through German air defences. What air defences does Germany have set up in Poland at this point? And it's not going to require as much of manpower. There's a discussion going about North Africa versus Norway, etc., supplying troops for it. You do have the large numbers of Norwegian troops as well you'd be activating. And that's going to be part of the factor, because if Norway is fighting and able to fight, and Felicia, Carl Gustav Felicia and de Wet are both leading their divisions hard for Oslo, combined with the local forces and the local personnel, and if they've got guns and they're able to activate the supplies in Trondheim, supplies in Narvik, and remember again, their own vessels, their own coastal defence ships are going to be able to be used as well, then they can win Oslo. They can win the fight. Bedron. Well, in this scenario, Norway, we've changed scenarios. We were in the scenario where Norway was neutral, which was the first slide. This is the scenario where Norway was actually invaded, so Norway is now an actual allied combatant. I'm not sure if I made that. If I didn't make that clear enough, I'm sorry. But literally, we've jumped. As I said, beginning, there are two scenarios. If Germany doesn't actually land, then Norway might just go actually very pro-British, pro-British neutral. If Germany actually lands and fights and invades Norway, it's going to turn it into an allied combatant. And someone said Eastern Poland is Russian territory. Yes, but yeah, you can straighten up that line a bit. And my gooch, that means the RAF could be flying bomb missions to support Russia if Barbarossa goes ahead, hitting German listics. Yes, and also potentially the Soviet Union could send their own bomber forces to Norway to operate from Norway if they wanted to. It could be, you could end up with, there is a theoretical option when I work through this, where you ended up with a Soviet bomber force, and a Royal Air Force bomber force, an American bomber force, all operating from the same base in Norway at one point. When I was talking it through, it was, the scenario did actually work out. So, with this going on, it's going to factor into a lot of other things. I'm not convinced by the RF being able to navigate all that way and hit the target and results in 40-42, but it will certainly make them improve navigation faster. I think they could do it. I think they can, and they have the option and capabilities of doing it. I think it's going to be tough, but I think they can do it. There shouldn't be any ads running. I haven't got the auto ads inserts going, so there should be no ads showing up. Right. So, the North Sea. Now, I was very tempted at certain points to think, well, would this create the North Sea barrage again, like World War I? Or the North Sea minefield? Or the various other things which I have nasty names for it. No. Adrian, I suspect Sweden would become involved if Norway was with the Allies. Germany invade after the fall of France. You can try. Nicest way. If Germany did choose to invade Sweden rather than invade the Soviet Union, that would be an easy way to lose a lot of troops. Because let's be honest, Sweden does take the muscular, neutrality approach. They are heavily mobilized already. The moment the Germans are invading Denmark, the Swedes start mobilizing. There might have been the German plans for coddling on Norway by hopping into Sweden. The Swedes were already awake and going, yeah, that's not a good idea. I do not see any good scenario of the Germans invading Sweden. They just do not have the forces for that. So they could try, but yeah, and if Sweden ends up joining the Allies, Lord help the Germans. And the Vickers Wellington is a very rugged aircraft that can take a lot of punishment. Yes. So here is the thing. There is this lovely diagram which I found, which is of fighter coverage. And I suddenly thought, well, if you've got fighters operating out of Norway, and you've got fighters operating out of Britain, you can pretty much cover most of Denmark with British fighters. from the get-go. And if you've got long-range American fighters being sold to the British and British and Norwegians and operating from Norway, imagine how far they can hit. And as Max pointing out again, Oboe network. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do. Sweden, the thing is, if you've got those fighters up there North Sea, they're going to be patrolling across it, which is going to have an impact on that. You're going to have the Sunderlands. They're able to go backwards and forwards across the North Sea with impunity. Whether Norway's a benevolent neutral, in which case my view would be that they'd be told, right then, if you're damaged and you can't get back, land in a fjord, burn your aircraft, or rather burn your key documents, leave your aircraft be, get ashore, here is some Norwegian money, here is a map of Norway, get to Narvik, board a British merchant ship in there picking up supplies and get back to the UK. And honestly, the Norwegians would probably turn a blind eye to it. After all, the Germans had almost invaded them, and that's in the neutral scenario. Under a scenario where they're allies and actively involved in the war because the Germans actually landed and actually fought them, well, that's going to be very different. Ooh, I've had a donation from someone. Thank you. That's going to be massively different. Woody. Thank you. Norway is going to be... These aircraft are going to be flying backwards and forwards. And think about it from the German submarines' perspective. Or German surface raiders' perspectives. Literally, the aircraft will take off in Britain, fly to Norway, refuel, rearm, and fly back. They will be able to carry a full, heavy load of systems, everything they need to do the attacks. And it'll be a constant flow of aircraft going backwards and forwards. You don't have to worry about the GIUK gap or the gap of aircraft coverage. The submarines and the ships will be having a nightmare trying to get out of the North Sea. There'll be a huge band of area of travel where they will have to be either underwater or they'll be having to dive immediately the moment they hear an aircraft. And for the aircraft, it makes things a lot easier. It turns the North Sea into a version of the Bay of Biscay, where they know where the German boats have to traverse, so they can deal with them. Add in minefields, add in motor torpedo boats, add in the convoys going backwards and forwards between the UK and Norway, and all the escorts with them, and suddenly it's a nightmare. Yes, you can go and attack those convoys. Those convoys are probably going to be heavily attacked by German U-boats, because that's going to be as far as they can friggin' get. Which is going to change the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Let alone the Arctic convoys, but the entire thing is going to be about this fight up the North Sea, and sort of off the coast of Norway. And it's going to be only worse if Hitler's made that decision about the surface ships. If Hitler has gone against what I don't think he would get rid of the surface ships and the major surface units in 1940 after losses. But if he has decided to get rid of those, then what does the Royal Navy need to risk in those waters? They don't need to use their large surface ships anymore. You'd suddenly see all the cruisers and above withdrawn from these waters. They would be off in the Mediterranean. They'd be off in the Far East. They would not be in home waters. Because you don't need them. Because if the Germans aren't bringing out anything larger than a torpedo boat or a submarine, you don't need a cruiser. You don't need a battleship. You don't need an aircraft carrier there. Not a fleet one. Railway thinker, you could see commando raids into northern Germany and Poland. You could. Especially submarine-based ones. The SBS, instead of operating from Malta and off the coast, going up and down the coast of Italy, doing nasty things there, could be spending their times doing nasty things in the Baltic. And as everyone goes, well, the Allies, how many boats can make for us? Sweden? Yes. Well, that's the thing is the British could be getting those from buying those from Sweden, even if Sweden's neutral. Under any of these scenarios, where they have got that railway route through from Narvik into Sweden, and they've got access to those ports, they can be buying Bofors, they can be buying things from Sweden. My coach, skewers based in Norway could reach German naval dockyards, so the subsidy kind of flying at home. It would be interesting. So the North Sea becomes an absolute nightmare for the Germans, which changes everything. Because, let's put it this way, traditionally we have some other pair of R-class based in Halifax to assist with convoys. Well, you wouldn't need the R-class based in Halifax. You probably have one based in Scotland and one based in the coast of Norway. If the Germans still have large surface ships. If the Germans still have large surface ships, you have one sitting on either coast. And then you have some fast ships going backwards and forwards, escorting and protecting them. Acting as the rapid reaction group. Which will, in the moment aircraft detect them, will go, yeah, we're coming. Any German capital ship going, yes, I'm making a raid in the North Sea to go after the convoys, which will be going off up, behind the Shetlands, will come face to face with, hello, have you met me? My name is, King George V, Queen, who knows what else there. So that is the scenario you're dealing with. It's really not good. And the Sunderland flying boats are just having a dream. And this is one of the interesting things is, we talk in World War II about the difficulties of the Coastal Command getting enough long-range maritime patrol aircraft. Well, think about the differences in requirements if you're just flying between the UK, between Scotland and Norway, rather than if you're having to cover the GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. Think of the differences in the aircraft. Think of the differences in supplies and numbers of aircraft you need. Now, please don't get me wrong, there's still France in this scenario, and France has fallen. But, and as have the Netherlands. But for Germany to get submarines to France, they'll either have to sail out through this North Sea, they'll have to sail through the English Channel and the Straits of Dover, or they'll have to be cut up and put on trains, taken to a French shipyard, and reassembled in the shipyard, probably by French workers. None of those are good scenarios. None of those are good scenarios. Seven critical. Will the Germans attack the USSR in these conditions, having a logistic friend in Norway? Honestly, in this scenario, if I was getting my oil fields bombed, I wasn't getting my iron ore, etc., and my surface fleet was pretty much blocked up, yes, I've won France, so that's going to be my ego trip, but I'm basically hemmed in from the north. I'm not sure what you do. I would say a sensible person would be trying to sue for peace, but Hitler's not sensible. And quite a lot of the wider leadership is not sensible. They believe their own hubris. And they've just conquered France, remember, so they've got that ego. They've conquered the Low Countries, i.e. Netherlands, Belgium, and all sort of in that scenario. They've Luxembourg, and they've conquered Denmark. They've conquered Poland. They've got Austria back. They've conquered Czechoslovakia. Well, they've conquered Czechoslovakia. Honestly, I think they might be pushed going south. And remember, historically they do, because they go with the Italians to back them up and try and attack the Greeks. So I think that's what they're probably going to do. As for how does the Kriegsmarine train in the Baltic, well, I don't think they are able to train in the Baltic. I think very quickly, especially if there are bow fighters and other British aircraft, torpedo bombers, put into Norway, etc., and foraging into the Baltic, and there are submarines and torpedo boats operating through the Skagerrak and Kattegat, I think that becomes a very, very dangerous area. I don't think anyone probably ends up with control of it, and I think that's more problematic for the Germans than it is for the others. Now, this goes on. War in the UK. This is a map of traditional bombing operations in the UK from Norway and some of the traditional reaches. Now, that only lists the Ju-88s, 87s, and other sort of their smaller, lighter aircraft. If you look at the Britain and the bombing operations, you'll notice Edinburgh, most of this sort of the north, the Scottish coast, etc., and even Glasgow, is fairly lightly bombed. They're still bombed, please don't get me wrong, but compared to some area. But this is because of the range of aircraft which could get that. If you don't have these aircraft able to reach from Norway, there is going to be an make it incredibly difficult. Yes, the Germans can theoretically still reach there, but if you've got fighters operating out of Norway with something like Chain Home Command established in Norway, and I don't see why the British wouldn't push for that. Yes, it would take resources, but it'd be worthwhile. You could very well end up with a scenario where the Germans cannot reach anywhere really north of the Humber in the UK without having to go through multiple layers of fighters. And that's going to have a tremendous effect on British industry and development, because if you consider the amount of effort the shadow factories, etc., went to move manufacturing out of all these areas, and these are traditional industrial areas of Britain, they don't have to move as many of them. So some of the bigger yards, some of the bigger facilities can keep going, and this is going to affect things like battleship construction and aircraft carrier construction. You're not going to be interrupted as much. You're not going to have to deal with the threats of the bombs as much. You're also going to change a lot of the scenarios in terms of what you're dealing with threat-wise. Because for the Germans, one of the things they were very good at timing was using their long-range maritime patrol aircraft operating out of Norway to watch the convoys across the Atlantic, guide in their U-boat packs, and also time their bombing raids to attack Liverpool when those convoys turned up. Well, if you've not got Norway, and you've now to get out into the North Atlantic, your aircraft have to deal with fighters based in Norway and fighters based in the UK, especially things like Mosquito fighters, which you could, with radar, etc., which appear not too long into the war, this becomes a nightmare scenario. Runan, I will say this, I'm only at slide 9 of 17, so I don't think we're getting through this too quickly. So, you have a very realistic scenario going on here. A very realistic scenario. That Germany ends up not being able to hit Britain as well as it did hit Britain. Sorry, this is not going to help Britain in this region. You're going to have fighters going off to Norway as well, which is going to affect forces, but you're going to have more spaces to train your own pilots in the UK, so you're going to be less reliant on the Empire pilot training scheme, because you're going to have safer zones to do pilot training. You're also going to have an impact in terms of you're going to have spaces for fighter groups to recoup and recover themselves and then come back into the fight. More of that. But you're also going to have an effect on this campaign of the loss of the aluminium, the loss of the iron ore. All those things are going to have an impact on the German forces. Not on the German forces in 1940. Okay? That's the first thing you're going to realise. Iron ore, loss of aluminium is not going to have an impact on German forces in 1940, the ones you're directly facing. It's going to have an impact on the ones in 1941. It's going to have an impact on the replacement of those forces. If we consider the sheer quantity of aluminium and alumina which Norway was supplying by the end of World War II to Germany and several points, and we consider the sheer amount of iron ore that was going through from Sweden to Germany, you could be talking as much as probably a 40 to 50% drop in aluminium. In terms of the aluminium capacity of construction of aluminium, and a good possibly as much as 50% less steel overall, because of the problems you're going to have in terms of the quality of iron and where it's going to go, and the effect of putting that production through various filters and purification to make it higher quality to deal with other things. So the entire World War II, as we understand it, could be very different. Duke mentioned, what would Norwegian Navy look like? Would they license production? You give us like tribal with both his guns. The Norwegians tend to produce their own designs and have some pretty good yards, but they do tend to also order their larger ships from Britain and from occasionally other people. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are ordering them from others. I'm not sure if they'd be building them in Britain or if they'd be building them in Canada. Maybe even America. It's all going to be an interesting scenario as to where they're ordering and what they're getting. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're ordering a lot of them. I think the thing I could see the Norwegians get a lot of would be also what they got a lot of historically for the Navy. I think Flower-class corvettes to escort those convoys backwards and forwards. And I think motor torpedo gunboats, i.e. Fairmail Ds, would be pretty high up on their ordering lists. There is a reason for that, because with the scenario, does Norway need to have cruisers and the larger ships? Not for what they're operating in. They need a lot of the smaller ships. Britain has more than enough for this scenario, especially. And the two scenarios we're looking at, either the Germans have lost a lot and are of their cruisers, of their destroyers, and their capital ships, and are therefore severely restricted. So therefore, the Royal Navy has more than enough for the duties. And of course, the Norwegians still have their large coastal battleships, large coastal defence ships, because those weren't sunk in the first Battle of Narvik. So, because of course there are 3 battles of Narvik. There's the one where the German Navy sinks the Norwegian Navy there, the second where the H-class turn up, and the third one where the Tribal class, with some other supporting friends, and HMS Warspite turns up. So if the first Battle of Narvik doesn't happen, Ironsfold and her sister are still around, and they don't need larger ships or ships different than that for most of their duties. Because remember, they're not going off to the Mediterranean or something like that. So they still need Flower-class corvettes and probably Hunt-class escort destroyers to go backwards and forwards to escort the convoys. But yes, it'll probably be a large number of Fairmail Ds ordered. And Swedish ball bearings as well. Going to be very useful for gun mounts. Was Germany getting refined advanced steel from Norway, or were they getting just ore and low-grade steel from occupied Norway? They were getting good stuff from Norway. Good stuff came through Norway and Sweden. As well as they were getting the ore as well, but they were also getting some of the refined stuff, as I understand it. That's why they call it alumina and aluminium. Runan, do those coastal battleships take part in various amphibious operations later in the war? Well, again, and don't take this the wrong way, I haven't really gone past 1941 because things could change dramatically. But with the lack of fuel, etc., that can cause things. But if I was doing an amphibious operation in World War II and I had Norway and a neutral Sweden, I know I'd be tempted to land in Denmark. Because let's be honest, which is closer a shorter distance to get to Germany? Landing in Denmark or landing in France? I would make them think I was going to land in France. I would certainly lead them to believe I was going to land in France. And then I would take all my armada up to the coast of Norway and bring it down on Denmark. Because that's far closer. And far easier to support. Now, that's the war in the UK. Well, let's consider North Atlantic. So here are some stats which are interesting, and they are quickly taken by me, and I have to admit, what I did was, I do admit this, okay? I have a very useful little phone. It converts text. It takes photos and can convert the text into readable stuff that can be put into documents. And I do that with books sometimes because it speeds it up and is better than my, how do I put this politely, dyslexic brain sometimes, copying stuff out 3 times and getting it different 3 times in a row, even though I'm reading the same stuff and I know what I'm reading. Well, this does occasionally lead to small differences, but hey-ho. It's fine. In the case of this scenario, we have 3 of the most important types of German submarines. And as you can see, there were 50 Type 2 submarines built, there were 703 Type 7 submarines built, and 194 Type 9 submarines built. These are some of the most important number-wise submarines the German Navy actually had. And I've put in their 2 most numerous variants, which usually make up the majority of their numbers. So you've got the 20 Bs and the 16 Ds from the Type 2s. You start to realise what their maximum ranges are underwater. And that's an important thing to think about, because before they had the bases set up in Norway and France, that area, the really darkly shaded area on the map, is their area of principal operation. It's where they can mostly get to. It's also before the channel's really blocked. And of course there's nothing going across between Scotland and Norway to act as keeping them underwater. What does this mean? Well, as I've already said, if your only options to get your submarines to operate from France are either have Italian ones go through the Straits of Gibraltar and operate from France, if Italy's entered the war on your side, probably has with the fall of France, because that was the main thing Italy's interested in, the French, not Norway. But with the impact of those patrols, etc., on those U-boats, can they get through the channel? Probably still can, but you're going to spend most of your time underwater going through the channel, so you hug down the coast and get to the bases in France, but it's not going to be easy, and you're going to lose boats doing it, because the channel is not as deep as you'd like it to be, and the British have a lot of ASDIC-equipped motor torpedo boats running around. And honestly, if the Royal Navy is forced to choose between losing an ASDIC-equipped motor torpedo boat for getting one of your U-boats, Whilst they don't want to lose the crew, they're more than willing to make it. They're willing to take the loss. You then have a North Sea barrier scenario going on where you've got aircraft constantly flying up and down. You've got flying between Scotland and Norway. You've got escorts covering convoys constantly moving across between, I don't know, Liverpool and Trondheim, between Rosyth and Trondheim, between, Northern England and Trondheim. That sort of scenario. You've got all those things going on. I don't see a lot of U-boats getting into the North Atlantic. I really don't. And this becomes a really interesting impact on World War II, because think of it. If you don't have the huge North Atlantic campaign, the Battle Atlantic, as it is historically, you probably still have those convoys being escorted by sloops, etc. They might well be a scenario where they get a couple of long-range trawlers or things to escort them across the Atlantic. Maybe they have an old cruiser with them across the Atlantic, just in case a surface radar or something turns up. When they get into the at-risk zone, as the British will probably call it, kind of like in World War One, they'll be picked up by a strong escort, maybe outside the at-risk zone. The escort will pick them up. That escort will have escorted a convoy to that zone, to the edge of out to that zone, and then it'll pick up another convoy going back in. And they will head north. They will hug north, okay? These U-boats, these vessels will not come south. If they know there are bases in France, admittedly with all the less of the drop in sort of steel, iron ore, and all the other things, they might not build those U-boat pens in France, but they still might do. They're going to keep as north as they can do, and they're going to come in from the north and come down. And they might not all go into Liverpool. Or they might not all go to Liverpool. They might go into Liverpool and Newcastle. They might come both sides of the UK coast, because they can afford to. Because the safest route is to come from the north and divide up, and convoys go either way, in order to divide the German efforts. You suddenly have, for less vessels, you have a far stronger convoy. Because if you think about it, instead of your convoy maybe having to provide an escort to a convoy for a whole transatlantic crossing, you only might have to provide it for the last 3-4 days. Which, let's say the crossing is... I'm going to arbitrarily pick a figure, okay? Let's say it's 20 days. Let's say it's a really slow crossing of the Atlantic. A really slow crossing of the Atlantic. Suddenly you need a fifth of the escort force to escort that convoy. Or rather, to escort the convoys. Because you're only having to escort them for a fifth of that route. So you can easily double up the strength of the ships, and you still have ships spare. Because you're deploying them you don't have to deploy them for as long with each convoy. So this is going to have a big impact on operations. It's also going to stop a lot of the German vessels getting out, because whilst they might be operating from France, if they are operating from France, getting in and out, they're not going in and out the North Sea, they'd be running a gauntlet each way, which is going to have an effect on their numbers. Going through the Channel is going to be a gauntlet going each way. And then you've got the Bay of Biscay. The British will quite happily, again, as they did historically, probably keep a heavy patrol in that area. You might get further. You might be able to go south. You might be able to... There will be submarines which will do that. There will be individual crews which will manage these feats. But there won't be a lot of them. There won't be many of them. And they will be major feats when they happen. Okay? So... Alright, so to the Med next. Potentially, no, it's different. Potentially it'll be the Mediterranean next. But anyone questions about North Atlantic? What do you think of this scenario? How do you think it affects it? Because, as I said, in my thinking, it changes things completely. You quite possibly do not even have the happy time, the second happy time at all in America, and I'm not sure if you even have the first happy time. My gosh, it's not just the heading of subs. Milk cows and surface resupply. Well, I don't see the submarines necessarily operating far enough away to justify the milk cows and the resupply ships. Because the resupply ships, they're going to get massacred trying to go through there, and they're not going to have the Norwegian bases to sneak out from through the GI-UK gap. So yeah, maybe they can operate out of France, but that's not going to really work for them as well. And they're not going to get out of Germany. And for the... in the milk cows, it's the same thing. They're going to have the milk cows would have to do it completely would have to go underwater for a long way. They're going to be running the same risks as the submarines. So you can't do that. In nice way, you lose a milk cows. The U-boats are going to have to come back, and so the U-boats which have got through then have to operate with the idea that if the milk cows fail to get through, they have to maintain enough supplies to get home through there. So there is really no Battle Atlantic on the scenario. It becomes, I would say, you almost get it folded into the Battle of Britain, in that you get a Battle of Britain, which is a convoy war as well as an air war. And I just don't think it works out well for anyone involved in attacking it. It really doesn't. Then we have the Mediterranean. Well, you remember earlier Glorious survived. Glorious survived. Now, what do I think happens there? Well, that's going to be an interesting one, because I think Glorious ends up in the Mediterranean with Eagle. Which means you have two carriers operating at that point, so Eagle might be sent in for repair when she's first hit by a bomb. But either way, or rather, bombs come close to her and damage her fuel system. They make quick fix, but they don't do a proper fix. But either way, the moment Illustrious turns up, she's guaranteed to be repaired. In which case, bear with me here, when you launch Taranto attack... when you carry out the Taranto attack in 1940, the odds are, quite strongly, that you have 3 carriers present. And let's consider that, because HMS's Glorious's crew, for starters, that means you've got all those damage control experts not lost. You've got all those personnel not lost when she's sunk. She can carry roughly 48 aircraft. Now, normally, that's roughly... that would be, probably in this scenario, 24 Swordfish, possibly some Skewers, and some Fulmars. More likely Fulmars and Swordfish by the time she's out there. They'd also have Illustrious. Could also be carrying roughly 24 Swordfish. And Eagle, which would be carrying roughly 24 Swordfish. You get the point? That's 72 Swordfish. The Battle of Taranto involved the Royal Navy launching 21 aircraft because of various issues in terms of damaged aircraft. But you're going to have more supplies, more stores between 3 carriers, so you're more likely to have more available. But let's say you do have some issues. Let's say you only launch out of roughly 72 swordfish you could have aboard, you could have between the three carriers, let's say you launch 60. 21 torpedo bombers, achieved 3 battleships disabled, heavy cruiser damaged, 2 destroyers damaged, and 2 other aircraft damaged out of the 6 battleships and the 7 heavy cruisers. And as I've talked before with Taranto, the fact is the spacing of the Italian vessels means the Giulio Cesare is pretty much impossible to attack with torpedo bombers. Pretty much impossible. However, if you have 3 times the aircraft involved, I'm fairly certain pretty much every other Italian battleship gets hit at least once, if not twice, by torpedoes. If Glorious is carrying any skewers, then I'm not sure whether even Giulio Cesare survives. But she's going to get damaged. This means that Taranto, instead of being the battle which gives the Royal Navy a huge confidence boost and gives them the impression of great success, doesn't actually wipe out the Italian Navy, doesn't actually stop them operating. It just lowers their operations for a few months, and it, causes the Giulio Cesare to be principal asset for a few months. The fact is, it would probably put the Italian Navy back to the point at which you might have Giulio Cesare as the only viable battleship left. Because of their supplies. Because of the damage done. Because of the need to rebuild the ships and their infrastructure limitations on them. At which point you end up with a really interesting scenario. Because, for starters, Crete doesn't happen. Why? Because remember, Crete doesn't fall to the parachute forces. The British are managing to recover from them. It's the amphibious forces which are covered by the Italian battle fleet, which really make a big difference in Crete and provide the heavy unit. If they don't have those forces, they aren't deploying them. If Crete therefore survives as an aircraft, as a sort of a British island, that's somewhere they can base fighters on from to defend their fleet moving around and help with the security of Malta and the supplies going backwards and forwards. But B, it could also be where more bombers are based from. You could actually have bombers flying from Crete, attacking Romania, and going up to Norway, or vice versa. Whatever happens, the odds are the Italian fleet that's left after a 3-carrier attack on Taranto is going to be very different and a very different level of threat than the Italian fleet which justified the vast bulk of the Royal Navy's forces deployed there in World War II. Do you need to have Force H at the strength it was historically if you only have Giulio Cesare there? Or can you afford to just have an R-class there? Remember, I've deployed a couple of R-class to Norway and Britain. You've still got 2 more left. Will the R-class battleships be enough for the Mediterranean if you've just got Giulio Cesare? In which case, the Queen Elizabeths, the modernised Queen Elizabeths, could be backing up the King George V's. It could be Queen Elizabeth, Warspite and Valiant, plus King George V, Anson and Howe, which are securing the North Sea from Germans escaping if Tirpitz and Bismarck and Scharnhorst are still surviving and still being kept, still built up. Because let's be honest, again, if they're going to sail up and you're going to be able to see them coming, there isn't the room for them to manoeuvre to. You really use their speed to try and break away and not be intercepted by Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, along with Anson, Howe and King George V. That could be your force holding it, which could well leave the remainder of Renown, Repulse and Hood and Prince of Wales and Duke of York to be the core of your capital ships going to the Far East as a deterrent to Japan. Your other 2 capital ships, which are, by the way, are your 2 unreconstructed Queen Elizabeths, Barham and Malaya, might well be in the Mediterranean. They might well be your Mediterranean fleet, along with your R-class, along with sort of the 2 R-class could be at Gibraltar, and Barham and Malaya could be at Alexandria, and they would be supporting the troops moving along the coast. Because here is the point you would have happening in Mediterranean. You would have the Royal Navy very quickly have control of it. If the Italians have lost their capital ships and have lost a sizable portion of their heavy cruisers, then they don't have enough fighting power to really push back against the Royal Navy. And so the Royal Navy don't need to have those ships, as many of those ships, or their newer and better ships, here. And that's going to have an impact on the North African campaign. Because if the British are able to count on Crete and Malta as air defence positions, if they are therefore able to operate along the north coast of Africa with impunity, with maybe Malaya and Barham pushing along, then Malaya and Barham, combined with whatever forces assisting them, and they might still maintain an old carrier, they might keep Eagle with them, etc., they will be able to push along the coast with the support of forces, with the support of air bases around the coast, cutting off the Italians and the North African forces from supplies. They would literally move along the coast, cutting off them from supplies and stopping them being able to resupply. And you have the troops come in afterwards. So once they've run out of supplies, the troops turn up and go, do you want to surrender? You have no food and no fuel left. Because North Africa is a logistics campaign. Hi, Dan. We didn't talk about this yesterday because if we talked about this yesterday, it would have ended up being a joint project, and I didn't want to be able to doing anything without giving you proper credit. So that's why I avoided the topic. Hello. See, Richard, Cape Matapan doesn't happen because the Italians, maybe they repair some of their battleships, maybe they don't. But the thing is, they've now lost so much repairing the rest, etc. Moving up North Africa. At what point do you launch out for Cape Matapan? Once you get those ships repaired? Well, okay, while you're repairing those ships, the British are going to be watching. The moment they come out, they're going to have more forces. And the odds are the British put a fleet in the Indian Ocean. And that fast fleet is going to be heavy to deter the Japanese. It might be based at Singapore, but it's probably going to be based closer than that, Ceylon, so that it can go either way. It can either dart up to into the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean if the Italians are actually reactivating their battle fleet, or reactivating any of their battleships which are worthwhile, or go north. And the other scenario is, where are Nelson and Rodney in this scenario? Because they could be sitting in the home fleet, backing them up there. They could be in the Mediterranean fleet with Barham and Malaya, in which case, that is not a battle line I want to take on. I want to run away from that if I'm the Italians. They could be in the Far East, backing up the fast battleships. Or alternatively, they could be the slow ships securing either side of the North Sea, in which case the 2R class could be in the Far East, being the slow ships. The thing is, when you've got destroyers and cruisers operating out of Malta and submarines operating out of Malta, and you've got aircraft operating on Malta and Crete, and you've got the fleet moving up the coast, and they can block off your ability to resupply. You can't use Benghazi. If a British battleship is able to block it off, and the Italians can't send out a battle fleet to intercept it or fight it, they can't keep resupplying. If they've got the supplies are weak enough, they cannot get, they haven't got fuel for their aircraft, and the British Army's moving up. This is what you would see. You'd see a combined action going forward. Now, the really interesting scenario in this is what happens to the Vichy French forces in North Africa. Because if they're all losing, do the Germans reinforce North Africa? Does the Africa Corps even get created in the first place, or does it not? Because remember, the Africa Corps is founded in June 1941. Under this scenario, the British could have been pushing up after they've taken out the Italian fleet pretty much from December 1940. So how far will the British have got in those 7 months? Will the Germans have been able to reinforce them? If they aren't able to get submarines through to them, and any submarines they get through to the Mediterranean aren't coming back. Once they're in the Mediterranean, they're not getting back past Gibraltar. So you've managed to get those submarines out through the channel, let's say, to get them to the Bay of Biscay to operate from your French ports you've captured. And now you want to send them through the Straits of Gibraltar to help make sure your forces get across the Mediterranean Sea to reinforce the Italians who cannot fight the battle themselves. You're not going to do that. So I don't think the Africa Corps exists in this timeline. I think Rommel is still back in Germany, probably looking at the invasion of the Soviet Union if they're going anywhere. But remember again, their oil fields in Romania are able to be hit from Norway. And also, if you've set up Crete, you can hit them from Crete as well. Oh, yeah, February 1941. Sorry, I was reading it. June 1941. I got my notes wrong. I have stats numbers on in June. But they only reached 33,500 troops in June 1941. So I don't think the major force is actually deployed that quickly. They officially set up in February 1941. But it originally consisted only of the 5th Panzer Regiment. And they are and then converted into the 5th Light Division, which is, yeah. The 5th Light Division is only pretty much there by March 1941. I don't think the Africa Corps, as we talk about, is actually there in force enough before June 1941, and I don't think it gets landed at all in this scenario. Dutch expansion considered a lot of weight. I wouldn't be surprised in this scenario if Hood and Repulse have been modernised. I would not be surprised if Hood and Repulse have been modernised because, again, you don't really... once you have the North Sea blocked off like that, you arguably don't need them running around at high speed as much. You can afford to have one of them being modernised. Richards, if the Royal Navy has 4 carriers in the well, I don't think at any point did I put the 4 carriers in the Mediterranean. I did. The 3 will be in the Eastern Mediterranean and 1 will be in the Western Mediterranean. But yes, the Italian fleet would still keep their ships in Taranto because they believed A, it was safe from torpedo attack of it being so shallow, and B, they believed they'd be told if the Royal Navy was approaching by the Italian Air Force. So the Regia Aeronautica are who the Regia Marina blame. So, Stephen Richards, they're still going to make it because they... Nicest way, the odds are any carriers in the Mediterranean... the Royal Navy had 2 carriers in the Mediterranean. That should have been enough to go, hang on, can they do this? And the Italians were confident. It's kind of like Pearl Harbor. The US Navy is confident they can't be attacked in Pearl Harbor. The Italians were confident they could not be attacked in Taranto. So I don't think, as said, in North Africa terms, I don't think that happens. I don't think the Germans actually deploy the Africa Corps, which could see North Africa campaign end very quickly. We could be talking by June 1941 it's over. In which case you have a very different scenario going on in terms of British forces and British commitments, because if the Mediterranean has pretty much been secured, and this is the thing, if Mussolini loses in North Africa and hasn't succeeded with Crete and has only succeeded in Greece with German support, like he did historically, and is there a shortage of oil because of Romania oil fields keep being hit, etc., and some of the other oil fields in the Balkans, etc., being hit, I wouldn't be surprised if Il Duce falls from power. I see him as far weaker than Hitler. Far more likely to be toppled. Because let's be honest, Il Duce is never the dictator that Hitler is in terms of his power. There is always a monarch. And there is always an opposition. There are literally senators who almost every single meeting of Parliament are standing up in the Senate and slagging off Mussolini and calling him an idiot. Sometimes to his face. That is not the measure of a strong dictator. Nice way, dictators often don't have that scenario. And so, if he's lost North Italy, I think Mussolini falls. North Africa, I think Mussolini falls. And yes, Scarpa Flow in 1939 is another example. Lots of people were confident on the basis. Scarpa Flow in 1939 is a good example because we didn't presumed that the same defences they constructed in World War I were still secure, and they hadn't really done enough surveying. And the Admiralty had surveyed it and gone, we need to replace these. And the government had gone, well, no, we do need to do some independent surveying because we don't necessarily trust your surveying and it's going to cost a lot of money and da-da-da-da-da. And I put it off. And then 1939, ouch! And then, of course, they overreact and go, we've got to do a massive amount of concreting and it's going to take ages to get there. Therein, first tanks arrived in March 1941 and not in huge numbers. Yeah, the whole scenario for the Africa Corps is fun. It is fun. And you know, the Africa Corps as a whole is an interesting organisation. There's every possibility that you have a similar scenario happen to Rommel as happened to Cruel, who of course landed here. Well, his pilot mistook British troops for Italian troops, landed nearby them, and of course was taken prisoner. And that was the second commander of the Africa Corps. It's interesting, the Africa Corps. Then from just thinking, if anyone didn't get attacked in World War II, British at Scarflow, French at Meza Kabir, Italians at Taranto, Germans at Brest, Americans at Harvard, Japanese at Truk. The Soviets got attacked in their harbours in the Black Sea and in the Baltic. So yeah, they got attacked. Hello, Yannick, and hello, Inns. I'm not sure if I said hello earlier. Anyway, hello. So, here is where things got to get really interesting for me. Because, as said, I think you have Repulse and Hood have been modernised by this point. I wouldn't be surprised if they've been modernised. And I wouldn't be surprised if your Far Eastern fleet, the core of the Far Eastern fleet that's set up, if they send a fleet out there, is going to be at least 2, if not 4 carriers. And is going to be probably Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Renown, Repulse, and Hood. I'm not sure where Nelson and Rodney are in this scenario. There are various options where they could be being used. They could be back in the home fleet in case the Germans try to break out into the North Atlantic to patrol that area. They could be reinforcing the Mediterranean fleet, especially this amphibious operation that's going on there. Maybe an invasion of Sicily or something happening. I think they are wandering around providing heavy muscle, but I could see it fast ships. And this is going to have a big impact. I would also add, whilst historically Tom Phillips is sent as commander, In this scenario, you would be sending a major fleet, which means you have an option of 2 officers, pretty much, in the Royal Navy that can be sent at this period to command. You can send Cunningham, or you can send Somerville. I don't think Cunningham, after orchestrating a very successful victory over the Italian Navy and basically demonstrating them, I could see him being sent out, but I see it more likely being Somerville, and Cunningham being used to basically orchestrate the naval war that's going to the whole operations that's taking place in the the North Sea and those scenarios. Mainly because Cunningham is on lines to replace, well, to replace Pound, and well, if you consider we're talking about post-December 1941, and Cunningham becomes it in October 1943, so he's only really just started his time as CNC Mediterranean Fleet. He's very much in there, so I think it could be Somerville that's sent. I think it could be Somerville that's sent with that larger fleet. After all, he was given Force H historically, and I think he still would have had Force H and would have done Mers el-Kabir, and he did get the Eastern Fleet. When it was decided, when they were sending a fleet, he was the one sent. Admittedly, that was after Phillips died. So that's your options. Cunningham or Somerville, really. It's going to be one of those two. There are other options you can, of course, consider, but they will probably not get sent. But Cunningham is in post traditionally till about March 1942, and then again November 1942 to 1943. So March, it's the king of, he could go a few months earlier and be sent to command the Eastern Fleet, which could be risen up. He could be retained in Mediterranean active fighting community, active fighting areas, and Somerville sent out. The odds are you would have Illustrious, Formidable, and Ark Royal, at least as 3 of the 4 carriers. I wouldn't be surprised if you have Victorious as well. The reason is you don't need more than Eagle to support the operations they're doing in the Mediterranean, and Glorious and Furious can probably do the stuff you need to do in the North Sea, North Atlantic. I'd also add that with the drop in number of submarines wandering around, the likelihood of Ark Royal having been hit by a submarine, where she was historically, goes down dramatically. I think that in a nice way, the Italians mostly withdrew their ships to be repaired as far up in the Adriatic as they could. I don't think anyone's sending Nelson and Rodney into the Adriatic. I don't think they need to. But Nelson and Rodney could be in the Mediterranean just in case the Italians do get a vessel ready. So it could be them along with Barham and Malaya. Pound had a brain tumour, as Dan Freeman's pointed out, so I think the Pound still has to happen. But the scenario then causes something very fun. Is Vian being sent as number 2 to the Far East? It's quite possible Vian will be sent as number 2. But remember, he's going to be a lot more junior than he was historically at this point. At this point, he's, I think, December 1941, he's a Commodore, possibly a Rear Admiral. But he's not as senior as he was. So, yeah. Hello, Georgie. And I think what you have then is, for the Japanese, you have a very different war scenario. Because I think they still probably do decide to take out the Americans first. There is a reason for taking out Pearl Harbor first, rather than going after Singapore. And I think also you have, if the British had deployed this fleet earlier, I think it's probably deployed to Ceylon like the Eastern Fleet rather than Singapore. It could be deployed to Singapore, and the long patrol I've stuck with them being at Singapore. But because in live I've got more time, I can explain the differential. I think if they are I think if you have Nelson and Rodney instead being part of the home fleet in case of German attempt to massive breakout, then I think you have this fleet stuck in the Ceylon, because then they can rapidly deploy to the Mediterranean if the Italians do mobilise to back up Bar and Malaya. So if they do manage to get their battleships available, they could suddenly find themselves fighting two King George V's modernised Renown, Repulse and a Hood added on. So you'd have them in Ceylon, which would mean they'd be a rather difficult journey for the Japanese to do without being detected. Because if you think about it, their option is to try and sail through Indonesia and the Philippines, pretty much, to try and, in avoiding the Straits of Malacca, certainly because of Singapore, to try and get to Ceylon to launch a surprise attack Ceylon, or go round Australia. It's just not really functional or feasible. But what does happen, even if it's at Singapore, you have to sail past the Philippines. You have to sail past a lot of things which could give away your position. So ideally, the first fleet you want to neutralise is the American one. They do that, though, they end up with a problem, because they're going to need their full fleet to go south. Because if you've got 4 carriers and 5 fast capital ships, that is a very scary force sitting in the South China Sea. That is not a force you can roll over with cruisers. That's not a force you can roll over with Congos. That's a force you can't roll over unless you bring your full fleet. So you have to wait for those ships to be brought back, to get back to Japan, to be refreshed, resupplied, repaired, and then you have to do your push south. You might not even hit the Philippines. You might not even hit the Philippines under that scenario. You might do, but you might not. In which case, you give time for that force to join up with some American vessels, whatever's available, probably a couple of carrier battle groups, maybe even 3 carrier battle groups. So you could have 3 American carriers, 4 British carriers, and 5 British fast capital ships form up into a fleet. And that fleet could mosey north and end up having a fight with the Kido Butai. I'm not sure where that battle takes place. I'd say somewhere around the Philippines. I'm not sure if it's in the South China Sea or North China Sea. South China Sea or the East China Sea. But somewhere around the Philippines area is where I'd recommend. And I would reckon it would unfold as the following. I would reckon the British would launch some night strikes. The Americans would take the lead in day strikes, and the British would take the lead in the air defense of the fleet. I have a feeling, and this is going to distress some people, but please understand when I'm saying this, if the British are supplying 4 carriers and 5 capital ships, and the Americans are supplying 3 carriers, then I'm fairly sure the fleet commander will be British. The second in command will be American, certainly, and it'll be a joint fleet. It'll be an interesting thrown together force, but I wouldn't be surprised if under those circumstances the Kido Butai gets bushwhacked. The reason I say this is because you're dealing with radar-controlled fighters from the British, and despite them being full Mars, etc., the British method of radar control is fairly advanced and fairly capable, and in this scenario you are going to have had some more advances in terms of fighter technology still going through with the Royal Navy. They're not going to have quite the same convoy battle experience, etc., that they've had in the Mediterranean already, but that was based on their pre-existing pre-war doctrine, so that's still fairly efficient. And so any Japanese attacks are going to find themselves dealing with layers upon layers of fighters. If you've combined up with night strikes, which have maybe taken out some of the Kido Butai or damaged them already, that's going to weaken the Japanese strikes capability dramatically. It's also going to mean you're probably going to have a location on their position, because the British one is to have a long-range fix on the enemy position as soon as possible, and they're going to be doing that because they've still got their search radar crypto aircraft. In which case, the massive American strikes will land in the daytime, and we'll know where they're going because they'll be given the information by the British and probably supported with extra British aircraft which are available. Which means I think you end up with one massive battle and the Kido Butai and the Japanese Navy gets sunk. A large number of it. What happens next after that? Well, you now have Germany effectively locked into Europe, and you have Japan effectively locked into Japan. That's going to change the war. Do you prosecute the war the same as you have done? Do you invade Japan? Do you invade Europe to get back Germany? You might well invade Europe to go back, because you might decide that's easier than invading the Japanese homelands. You might not. You might decide to do both at the same time. I have honestly no idea. It's going to be a whole long discussion. I don't think DeWitt will be in charge of ABDA.com. I don't think. I think he could be out there in charge of the ground forces, but I don't think it's necessarily him. And Admiral Holland isn't killed as well, so yes, he's still around. So maybe he could have been. There's another senior officer who could have been theoretically been sent, but probably not. Probably at Somerville, because he's used to carrier fleet command. There's not going to be an Indian Ocean raid, because the Japanese, you can't send the forces, if they send the forces they historically do into a Royal Navy fleet which is built around 4 carriers and 5 fast capital ships, that force gets massacred. So the Japanese have to change their plan. They have to knock out one fleet and then try and knock out the other. That gives time for the Anglo-American fleets to combine, and that's not a good scenario. And this all traces itself back to the fact that Norway frees up so much... Norway not falling, A, stops Courageous being sunk, but also frees up such a significant amount of British forces that they're able to successfully use their mass against the Italians, and use their mass against to block off the Germans into a far tighter area, which means they need far less forces, because they don't have to cover the GI-UK gap. They're carrying the Anglo-Norway gap. And that's a different scenario. You end up with this force being able to deploy. And think about it. I have deployed Renown, Repulse, Hood, Prince of Wales, and Duke of York. I have deployed 5 capital ships. I haven't deployed Royal Oak. She's sunk. Nelson and Rodney, I've got acting as free safeties there somewhere. I'm not sure where in the scenario. But we've accounted for all the ships. And they could all be available. Yes, Anson and Howe, people are going to go, well, you know, Anson and Howe aren't traditionally completed by this point. No, they aren't. But again, if you have the amount of iron ore, etc., coming into the UK, and amount of steel that could be coming into UK and aluminium, you probably are pushing them through. And I've put Anson and Howe on the home fleet. They are launched in February 1940 and April 1940 historically. They are not commissioned till April 1942 and June 1942 historically. The thing is, you could have them available. Duke of York would be is commissioned in August 1941, and Prince of Wales is commissioned in January 1941. So if you've got Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, and Valiant, the 3 modernised Queen Elizabeths, sitting in Scapa Flow, along with King George V, along with Anson and Howe, that is more than enough ships to deal with the scenario of defending the North Sea barrier, especially if you also have 2R class, one sitting in Norway, one sitting in Scapa Flow, you know, to help with convoy protection. Those 6 ships are more than enough to deal with whatever the Germans can put out to sea. So Warspite will not be in this specific scenario. Warspite will be over there. But there might be a scenario where Bismarck and Tirpitz and Scharnhorst, if she's still around, and as I said, I've given her, but really she shouldn't be given to the Germans in the scenario, where those 3 form up, and you end up with a battle in the middle of the North Sea between the 3 Queen Elizabeths, King George V, Anson and Howe on one side, fighting Tirpitz, Bismarck, and Scharnhorst. The Germans could launch a massive death ride to try and get out into the North Atlantic and cause massive disruption, or to disrupt those convoys going between Norway and the UK. So Warspite's not in the Far East, but Warspite's exactly where she needs to be. Now, I haven't got into Operation Barbarossa because, again, I'm not certain if the Germans launch it, because, or at least launch it on their traditional timeline, because, again, if you're bombing Romania, if you're bombing all those fuel supply lines, it's going to have an impact on their ability to launch operations. They might actually need to be importing fuel from the Soviet Union, and they probably will be. But if they do launch Barbarossa, then the Arctic convoys, as I've already discussed, are going to be pretty much going to be completely covered and protected the entire way round, whether Norway's neutral or part of the Allies. The German attacks on the Arctic convoys are going to be cut completely off for most of the route, and their most dangerous time is going to be leaving the UK. You could run them from Halifax to Murmansk without, any problem at all, without ever going into a German operational area. So you have that, and you also have bombers able to operate from Norway and attack the German supply lines. So that's going to affect Barbarossa. How it affects Barbarossa, I'm not sure, but honestly, I don't think it. I think Barbarossa gets cut a lot shorter. Christopher Rowe. So, I haven't answered your question, but I have already, to an extent, been into that when I was talking about Norway a bit earlier and talking about some of the things earlier. So, the whole scenario gets very, very interesting once you get further along. And also, again, Mitchell's Verdun, you talk about Queen Elizabeth versus Bismarck. If you've got 3 Queen Elizabeths and 3 King George V's combined together, taking on the 3 German capital ships, that is not a good scenario for the German capital ships. Especially in a scenario where they are going to be running into the face of destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines, and aircraft. No worries. You're quite right that it would cut into Hitler's raison d'etre, his, Lebensraum and all the stuff, etc. Not doing it, but even he has to an extent bow to the force of logistics. If Romanian oil fields are getting hit and getting seriously damaged, and they've got less oil, and they're not getting the iron ore or the iron ore from Sweden or the aluminium, either the 1940s version or the 1940 amount, or and especially not the increased amount they got later in the war from Norway, then frankly, the Germans can think about doing Barbarossa, but they're not going to be able to do it on the same. If they do it, it's not going to be done on the same schedule. It's going to take longer for them to prepare up the resources, or they are going to be dealing with other issues. And then you've got the fact that, as said, with North Africa collapsing, I think Mussolini loses power, in which case Germany might end up drawn into a war in Italy trying to restore Mussolini. In which case you could end up with not having an invasion going on with Italy, but Italy could swap sides to the Allies, and the British force in North Africa could be going into Italy to reinforce the Italians to fight for the Germans and push them out of Italy. It's just the entire level of complications which means they won't be going anywhere near the invasion of the Soviet Union. Where did Germany get copper? That's an interesting discussion to get into. Everyone, with King George, yes, that's what changes. Yeah, if you have 3 modernized Queen Elizabeths from 3 King George V's turning up to fight Bismarck, Tirpitz, and Scharnhorst, then I'm not placing any money on the Germans. Paulus, how likely is it that Hitler goes east early without taking all of France? Um, I don't. The thing is, going east earlier is not really possible logistically. They have to build railways, they have to build roads, they have to build everything to enable them to go east. This is one of the timelines of Barbarossa. Is that it's the timeline of construction of infrastructure. Now, good. Historically, Stalin was getting up to attack Germany in 42, so delay Barbarossa could mean Hitler being on the defensive in 42. It could do that, but it could also mean that if the Japanese are wiped out as a navy in 1941, early 1942, then and he's fighting in Italy against British and Italian forces. There's all sorts of problems that could be going on. Like, I wonder what the Norwegian reaction would have been to Britain if Britain invaded first. Just as dangerous for the British as for the Germans. That's why the British weren't doing it. The British looked at it. The British did look at it. And trust me, there are people like Churchill pushing it to an extent. But there were a lot of cooler heads who were going, this is not sensible. Including in the military, who were... The Navy and the Army were very good at running things incredibly slowly to give time for the calmer heads to prevail. So, the question that's normally asked at this point is, how much shorter is the war? Well, this is the thing. I have Japan still doing what it does in December 1941 because it's basically locked into that position and that approach from about 1940. But I also have the feeling that Italy might have a change of leadership in June 1941. Or earlier, depending on what happens in North Africa. Which could lead to either Italy trying to go neutral, getting and negotiating a separate peace deal with the Allies, or if Germany decides to try and restore Mussolini, which they're not really in a position to do. Their forces aren't arranged to do in June 1941. They're in the wrong places. I wouldn't be surprised if you end up with Italy jumping over to the Allies. At which point you have the British Army in North Africa is transferred to Italy. And it's not an amphibious invasion, it's a transferal. You can have a very interesting scenario. I think with Germany having the resources issues, etc., I could see especially it being interesting if you have the Vichy French forces in North Africa decide to change over to Free French forces in North Africa in the same period, in June 1941, roughly, and I could see you having a Free French, Italian, British Anglo invasion of southern France at some point in 1941. Maybe amphibious operation up the coast, but might well be through the mountains with support of special operations executive arrangements. And who knows what happens. Germany might not be able to do Barbarossa because they're fighting already in Europe. They're fighting in southern Europe against the British and the Italians and the Free French. I'd also say there could be an interesting scenario with the Greeks in that front, but we'll leave that to one side. I think if you have the Japan scenario, again, in that scenario where you have 4 British aircraft carriers quite possibly in the Far East, because, as said, I've stuck them in the Indian Ocean because that's the safest place for them, and Britain needs to deter Japan for war so their ground forces can concentrate on fighting in Europe and fighting elsewhere. So that will be the British plan. And stick them in the Indian Ocean, and they're perfectly safe from German and Italian submarines, because there won't be any operating out there in this scenario. And they are perfectly safe. They are perfectly capable of deterring the Japanese, and then they're moving from the Indian Ocean with 5 fast capital ships, 4 carriers, linking up with 2 to 3 American carriers, defending the Philippines when the Japanese send their forces south. I think that's a battle which the Allies win. I think it's a very different battle from that which the Japanese are prepared to fight, because I think, it starts off in nighttime. I wouldn't be surprised if because the British were doing a lot of offensive scouting. That's part of their core part of doctrine. Same with the Japanese, but the British will be doing a lot of it as well, which will lead to night attacks. Again, this is what Somerville tried in the Indian Ocean raid in Operation C. If the night attack had hit, goodness knows what happens there. Now, me and Jamie have done a video about that. And you have that as an ongoing scenario. You have that as an ongoing scenario. Pretty much the Japanese get their fleet bushwhacked. And yeah. You have a... What do you do with Japan? If all Japan's managed to do is successfully attack Pearl Harbor, and afterwards has got their fleet beaten up, hasn't managed to take the Philippines, hasn't managed to do anything else, it becomes a very different war against Japan, for starters. And yes, Michael Cooch, Stalin might well want to show solidarity to the Allies and make a grab for Manchuria, Korea, and all those sort of things. He might well do. But it also might well be a very different scenario for him, because it might be well remembered that he invaded Poland. And if he starts going offensive in this scenario, the Allies might beat him back as well. And at this point, it's a scenario. People go, well, hang on, are the Allies prepared to take on the Soviet Union? Well, the issue becomes, where does he go? Does he try to move from Poland into Europe? Which is not going to be something which the British are going to like, replacing one dictator with another. Remember, no one's enamoured with dictators. And the British have a lot more aluminium supplies under the scenario and a lot more iron ore supplies, and Germany hasn't had as many. So the Blitz could be very different. There's also the realistic scenario for the Soviet Union, that if they haven't joined the war, they are not getting the fuel supplies, especially aviation fuel supplies, which are so critical to some of their later war performance, and the engines and the other systems that are helpful and they sort of use to boost their late war performance. So as capable as they are, they're still stuck with their older equipment. There's also the scenario for the Soviet Union in terms of logistics and infrastructure. They can fight one war at a time. There's a reason why, A, they don't invade Poland until they finish the war with Japan, and they don't attack Manchuria, etc., until they finish the war in Europe. Because their logistics flows can go pretty much one way or the other. So he can either threaten Europe or he can threaten the Far East. And let's be honest, he's more worried about Europe. So I think Stalin probably does something in Europe. So I am going to say, how does Australia get drawn in the war? They get automatically drawn into the war. They're part of the empire. It's not a case of they automatically have to join the war, but they join the war. They join the war as they historically do. They're part of the British Empire. they get the option of, well, if you don't want to join, you don't have to, but they all join. Even South Africa comes along. So, any questions? And it is now... yeah. Roughly 3 hours. So, my view is I'll take questions for roughly another 15 or so minutes. And then I will have a quick comfort break. And then I'll be on Discord. Yeah, I'll be on Discord. Basically, my plan is to sort of do this to about do the live till about 10:30, then have about 5-10 minutes breaks, and then go to be on Discord. Night, Leslie. You answered. Okay. Peter, silver is a very good conductor with low impedance compared to aluminium. If you can get enough silver. BlackburnMaximus, how would this impact the British economic situation in comparison to the original timeline? A shorter war benefits the British. A shorter war where they don't lose as much of their merchant fleets, and so they don't lose a lot of their pre-war advantage in terms of their merchant vessels, is useful. A shorter war also stops the American mass production Liberty ships really coming in, so that's going to not swamp that particular market. It's also going to, whilst the debts are still going to be there, it's not going to be the same debts. And you've also had Norway, etc., as an ally for quite a lot, for the whole length of the war, so that's going to change things. I think the war ends probably about in Europe and in Asia. I wouldn't be surprised if the war ended in 1942. No worries, Dan. What about the German auxiliary raiders? What stops the Germans using them instead of warships? Well, the same barriers which affect warships are going to affect auxiliary raiders trying to get out to sea. In that, there's a merchant ship wandering about here on its own, which isn't broadcasting the right signals. Let's go investigate. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Paul. Do we lose the Golden Age, etc.? I have no idea if HMS Edinburgh gets sunk, but she might not be taking gold to the Soviet Union. Because if Barbarossa doesn't happen, she's probably not moving around, taking gold or moving gold around. So it's probably not the case. So you probably don't. And also, as I said before, the Arctic convoys are not going to be as high risk by a long way. Spindrift. If the war ends that much earlier, how does that set back the dawn of the atomic age? No Norwegian heavy water facility, no Fred German bomb, no Manhattan project. You might not get the combination of the combined Anglo-American project which leads to the Manhattan project. You might not get that. You will probably still get an atomic age come about, but it might be separate projects between America, Britain, all over the place. There's even options that... Let's put it this way. The main advantage the Americans had was being able to build an industry that could build it and develop it far away from German bombing. There are other options for that now. That was the major advantage. So you might end up with that project, you might not end up with that project. You might end up with that being an individual projects which are raced in sort of Britain and America and the Soviet Union, with all of them racing for these weapons, and who knows who gets where first. That's the reality of it. Thank you, Michael Coach. Thank you to Brock. I bet the British Empire's armed merchant cruisers will be used to hit the German trade. They probably would be. That trade which existed. Because again, this is the other thing you have to consider. The Germans have a lot of coastal convoys. They do have a lot of merchant ships trailing up and down their coasts. In this scenario, you don't have that in the Baltic. You don't have that in the going around the coast of Denmark, etc. And the British will probably spend quite a lot of World War II mining the Kiel Canal. That's going to be another problem for the Germans. Because to mine the Kiel Canal from Norway is a very easy operation. You fly down Denmark. Oh, there's the Kiel Canal. Boom. It's a great navigation route. And frankly, mosquitoes could do it in their sleep. In fact, the same mosquitoes might do it 2 or 3 times in one night. If you consider how fast a mosquito goes, how far the distance would be from Oslo to Kiel Canal. Yeah. The same mosquitoes could be doing multiple trips to the Kiel Canal every night. Dropping mines. It might get to the point where where actually mines are being dropped at a faster rate than they can be cleared. The canal could end up being more mined than water. Quite literally. Anyway. What have we got coming up? Next week is battleships and battle cruisers. That might have been. This week was building the fleets of Trafalgar. And I have to say, I was expecting that video to do better this week than it has done. It's done well, don't get me wrong. I'm happy with the number of people in the comments and people responding to it, but I was expecting it to do done more numbers. Because it is Trafalgar week. So, like usual, grand strategy discussion was a pleasure. Good evening, Doc. Thank you. And, yeah, so next week is battleships and battle cruisers. That might have been. And 31st of October is viewer's suggestion number 4. And I'm still taking in suggestions for that one. So you don't have to be a patron or anything to suggest a topic for the viewer's suggestion. You just have to put a comment and write in there viewer's suggestion, please, so I know it's a viewer's suggestion. Thank you, Autumn. And thank you, John Shea. And what else we got coming up lives? Next week, well, this week we have the Hutchison Pictorial History of the War series. Next Sunday, we have the Christmas books review. They have just arrived from Pen and Sword, the first batch of books which they're sending me. Ugh. There you go. The first batch of books have arrived from Pen and Sword for me to review for Christmas. So they're going to be in the Christmas review. And between that, we have battle cruisers and battleships are separate categories in the Washington Naval Treaty. Seems like a cool thing. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed. Thank you, Michael Cooch, Ince Morrison, BlackburnMaximus, Natalia Stavik, Dan Freeman, John Shea, Seven Kretu, Albazaski, Autumn, Spindrift, Knights of Great 1, The Brock, Paul Amos, BlackburnMaximus for suggesting this and for watching, Steve Clarke, Leslie Mitchell, Duke of Petchington, Adris Verdun, Peter Dawson. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Drakenred, Ince Morrison, Mike Cavallo. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And Adrian J, Christopher Rowe. Thank you, everyone who's been watching. Thank you, everyone who's been chatting away. Thank you, everyone who's just, I hope, enjoyed the time and have found it interesting. Thank you, Runon. And as said, I'm now going to have a bit of a comfort break and Sean Mack, and thank you, everyone. And I will be on Discord in a couple of minutes. First things first, I will have to find... Oh, they're there. They're there. They are there. My headphones. And then I'll be on Discord probably in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you very much everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you Malaga, thank you Bijon, thank you everyone. Take care. And Dunrick Armenhammer, thank you. Oh, good lord. I'm hungry. Mm-hmm.